cold settles in before anything else does. Not dramatic cold, just the kind that stiffens fingers around metal and slows thought by a fraction of a second. By December 1944, the forests around Bastogne had already begun to freeze into something rigid, something that resisted movement. Roads hardened, breath hung in the air. And somewhere inside that stillness, engines started to gather, German armor, infantry, fuel columns, assembling for an offensive that would fracture the Western Front open again. The plan came from Adolf Hitler, and it was built on compression. Drive through the Ardennes, split Allied forces, seize Antwerp, and force a political break. To do that, German units pushed more than 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks into a narrow sector, relying on surprise, speed, and weather that grounded Allied aircraft. Fuel reserves were tight. Some units carried barely enough to reach their initial objectives. That constraint didn't slow the plan, it sharpened it. Every mile mattered. At the center of the road network sat Bastogne. 7 major roads intersecting in a small Belgian town. Control it, and movement across the region stabilized. Lose it, and the advance fractured into delays and detours. That's why, when German forces began to push west, Bastogne became a target almost immediately. American units in the area were thin, scattered, already under pressure. Then reinforcements arrived. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division moved in quickly, many without full winter gear, some carrying only what they could load in hours. Inside the town, the situation tightened fast. German forces encircled Bastogne within days, cutting supply lines and isolating roughly 11,000 American troops. Artillery began to fall in steady intervals, not a single overwhelming barrage, but repeated strikes that eroded positions. Buildings collapsing, roads cratered, communication lines severed and repaired and severed again. Temperatures dropped below freezing, reaching levels where exposed skin numbed within minutes. Ammunition stocks thinned, medical supplies ran low. Morphine, bandages, plasma, each one rationed carefully. There's a detail that doesn't leave easily: the sound of boots on frozen ground during night movements. Not loud, but sharp enough to carry. Soldiers shifting positions, trying to avoid detection, aware that even a small noise could draw fire. Inside foxholes, men wrapped themselves in whatever they had: blankets, coats, sometimes just layers of damp fabric, waiting for the next artillery strike or the next order. Sleep didn't come cleanly. It broke into fragments. I remember reading General Anthony McAuliffe's situation reports and noticing how stripped down they were. No excess language, just direct assessments of ammunition, casualties, and pressure points. And then the moment came when German forces demanded surrender. His response, "Nuts," has been repeated so often it risks sounding symbolic. But in that context, it wasn't symbolic. It was a refusal issued under conditions where calculation might have suggested otherwise. Outside the perimeter, German units pressed in, but their advance began to stall. Fuel shortages tightened movement. American artillery, despite limited ammunition, he fired with precision. Defensive lines bent but didn't break. Air support, once weather cleared, returned with force. Transport planes dropping supplies, fighter bombers striking German positions and vehicles. The encirclement held, but it no longer tightened. Then came the movement from the south. Elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army pivoted north, advancing through difficult conditions to reach Bastogne. It wasn't immediate. Progress came mile by mile, through resistance and terrain that slowed everything down. But by December 26, 1944, contact was made. The siege didn't end instantly, but the isolation fractured. The pressure began to release. Step back for a moment, and the numbers settle into place. Around 11,000 American troops surrounded, facing elements of several German divisions, with temperatures dropping below 0 degrees Celsius, casualties mounting on both sides as the battle extended over roughly 1 week of encirclement within the larger Battle of the Bulge. But narrow your focus again, and it becomes something quieter. Frost forming on a rifle barrel, a medic counting remaining supplies by touch in low light, a soldier listening for engines in the distance that might signal relief or another attack. If you let it slow down now, the tension loosens just enough. You don't need to hold every movement in your mind, just the outline, a town surrounded, holding under pressure that tried to fracture it from all sides. There's more here. The planning failures, the intelligence gaps, the decisions that shaped the outcome, but not all at once. Let yourself settle into the stillness of it. The cold, the quiet between artillery strikes, the faint hum of distant engines moving closer. You can drift with that. This is the entire history of the Siege of Bastogne. Chapter 1. The Crossroads That Hitler Needed. The 16th of December, 1944. Somewhere in the Eifel Hills of Western Germany, before first light and before any American soldier knew what was coming, German artillery crews loaded the first shells of what would become the largest land battle ever fought by the United States Army. The guns opened at precisely 05:30 hours. The shells fell into fog so thick that the muzzle flashes were swallowed before they reached the tree line. For a few strange seconds, observers on the German side reported that they couldn't hear their own guns firing over the noise of the barrage. That's how many guns there were. That's how close they were together. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, roughly 80 kilometers to the west, sitting in a slight valley where the stone buildings of a small Belgian market town clustered around a town square, a road junction waited. 7 roads, 1 town. And Adolf Hitler had written its name in his personal directive. The town was Bastogne. It had a peacetime population of around 4,000 people. It had a post office, a seminary, a hotel, a rail spur. And it sat directly at the center of 7 converging roads, the only practical paved routes through one of the most geologically forbidding terrain features in Western Europe. The Ardennes Plateau is not forest in the romantic, navigable sense. It is a series of deep-cut river valleys separated by high ridgelines where the roads don't go around the hills. They go between them, and sometimes not at all. When you put a heavy armored column on the Ardennes road network, you don't have a column. You have a snake. You go where the road goes, or you stop. The Germans understood this. More importantly, General Baron Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, the formation tasked with taking Bastogne, understood this better than most. He'd asked about it specifically at a conference in Kielburg prior to the offensive. In the presence of 5th Panzer Army Commander General Hasso von Manteuffel, von Luttwitz was told that Bastogne would definitely have to be taken. He was not given the forces to take it. That gap between the clarity of the order and the inadequacy of the means is where this story really begins. What I find fascinating when cross-referencing the German planning documents against the unit-level operational logs is just how candid that discrepancy was. The post-war Foreign Military Studies series, those detailed assessments that German officers wrote for American military historians after the war, preserves the argument in both directions simultaneously. 5th Panzer Army's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Karl Wagner, stated in his assessment, document series MSB 235, that Bastogne did not necessarily need to be captured, merely encircled, that the offensive's momentum toward the Meuse River was the priority. Von Lüttwitz commanding the corps that would do the actual fighting, and believed the opposite, that leaving Bastogne unsecured behind a driving armoured advance was operational suicide. He was right. Wagner was rationalizing, and this argument, conducted in writing at conference tables before a shot was fired, tells you almost everything you need to know about why the German offensive eventually failed. The Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, had returned from the Saar region in a degraded state. Its official manning strength was 60% of authorized personnel. It carried 40% of its tanks and tank destroyers. One complete tank battalion had no tanks at all. This was the unit designated to take Bastogne on the second day of the offensive. The 47th Corps' other major formation, the 2nd Panzer Division, she had been resting and refitting for 4 weeks and was arguably in better shape, around 80% of authorized equipment. But even it had one Panzer Grenadier battalion still moving on bicycles to conserve fuel. Bicycles, in December, in the Ardennes. The fuel situation was, from the very first hour, the single most important material constraint on the entire operation. German columns had received only 50% of their promised initial fuel allocation before the offensive began, before any American resistance, before any bridge delay, before any traffic jam on a frozen Belgian road. The German tank crews were already doing fuel arithmetic in their heads and questioning whether the numbers reached the Meuse. The terrain was the third constraint, and I think it's the one that historians most consistently undervalue. The Eifel upland geology forces even medium-weight armoured vehicles onto the road surface. There's simply no tactical cross-country movement available for most of the advanced corridor. A German Mark IV tank weighed approximately 25 tons. The Tiger II, supporting some flanking formations, exceeded 68 tons. Bridge classifications on the Our River crossings, the first natural obstacle west of the German start line, were rated for far less. German engineers had to reinforce those bridges under fire on the first day, and 2 assault divisions were simultaneously attempting to use a single critical crossing point, creating a traffic jam that cost the 47th Corps hours it couldn't recover. The offensive was behind schedule on day 1 before noon. The Americans, meanwhile, hadn't yet arrived in Bastogne. When I look at the chronology here, really look at it, the margin between German success and German failure on those first 2 days is almost uncomfortably thin. The Panzer Division was supposed to reach Bastogne at 1800 hours on the 18th of December. Its timetable had it taking the town by the 19th. The Americans who would defend it hadn't left their rest camp in France on the 17th. The race was, technically, Germany's to lose, and lose it they did, incrementally, in a series of small engineering failures, fuel shortfalls, and road bottlenecks that a better resourced operation might have absorbed without difficulty. This offensive wasn't well resourced. Hitler had promised 3,000 aircraft to neutralize Allied air power. He delivered approximately 150 on the first day. He'd promised full fuel allocations. He delivered half. The entire enterprise was, from a logistical standpoint, something between an audacious gamble and a structured form of institutional self-deception. Hitler's personal directive named Bastogne by name. This matters. Corps-level tactical objectives are almost never specified in strategic directives. That level of specificity belongs to army group orders, not to the head of state. Hitler's insertion of himself into the tactical planning compressed the operational decision space available to every commander below him, because when the Supreme Commander personally identifies a town-level objective, every general between him and the objective becomes personally accountable for taking it. Von Lüttwitz couldn't simply bypass Bastogne on the grounds that his fuel state made the Meuse unreachable anyway. Von Manteuffel couldn't redirect his axis of advance without appearing to contradict a Führer directive. The chain of command was locked, not by military logic, but by political authority exercised at the wrong level. The result was that every German commander who privately doubted the operation's feasibility was also personally obligated to execute it without deviation. To me, the most honest document in the entire German planning record isn't a battle map or an order of battle. It's the margin annotation that survives in Wagner's post-war study, a penciled note next to the Bastogne road sketch, reading simply, 7 roads, this is the problem. It wasn't written as analysis. It was written the way you write something when you've just understood a problem and don't yet have a solution. Someone at 5th Panzer Army headquarters looked at that road convergence and felt, however briefly, the weight of what taking it would require. Then they submitted their orders, and the column moved west. The American formation moving east to meet it, by truck in the middle of the night, with inadequate equipment and no commanding general present, didn't know any of this. They didn't know about the fuel shortage, or the timetable slippage, or the penciled margin note. They knew they were needed somewhere in Belgium in a hurry. They were the 101st Airborne Division, and they'd been resting at Camp Mourmelon in France, trying to repair howitzers that had been damaged in the mud of Holland 6 weeks earlier. The contrast is almost structural in its neatness. On one side, a massive, technically superior armoured force running on half its fuel allotment, behind schedule, argued over by its own commanders, and locked into a directive written by a man who didn't understand road bridge weight classifications. On the other side, 12,000 paratroopers in borrowed trucks, heading toward a town they'd never been to, with no commanding general and howitzers that needed spare parts. What happened next is why this siege is still studied, argued over and remembered. Not because it was clean, because it wasn't. The last American vehicles to leave Bastogne during the initial German advance passed through the town square, heading west in the pre-dawn hours of the 18th of December. The last one carried a military police sergeant who reportedly stopped briefly at the road junction in the center of town, looked around at the empty square, and drove on. He left Bastogne intact, 7 roads quiet in the dark, 4,000 civilians in their basements wondering what was coming. What was coming from the east was the 47th Panzer Corps. What was coming from the west, down the very same roads in the very same darkness, was the 101st Airborne Division. They would arrive within hours of each other. The history of the next 10 days rests entirely on the fact that the Americans got there first. Chapter 2. The Division That Wasn't Ready. Camp Mourmelon, France. The evening of the 17th of December, 1944. The 101st Airborne Division had been there for less than 2 months, which in the context of the European campaign barely qualifies as a rest. They'd come from 72 days of sustained combat in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden, not the glorified version of that campaign that later memoirs would describe, but the muddy, artillery-saturated, canal-by-canal grinding reality of it. Equipment was damaged, personnel were under strength, and some of the division's artillery pieces were still receiving field repairs from damage sustained in Dutch mud. A formation that is technically still refitting is not a formation that is ready to fight. The orders that arrived on the evening of the 17th did not wait for the artillery to be fully repaired. The division had 805 officers and approximately 11,035 enlisted men present for duty. Most of those numbers looking respectable on paper in a way that somewhat conceals what the paper can't show. The equipment shortfalls, the missing specialist skills, the howitzers that had been struck off manifests and were still waiting for replacement parts. What the official strength roster for the 17th also doesn't show. And this is the detail that stops me every time I return to it, is that the actual commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington, D.C. His deputy, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England, along with 5 senior and 16 junior officers attending a briefing. Command of the division, by default, fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe's assigned role was Division Artillery Commander. He was not the division commander. He was the man in charge of the guns. And through a bureaucratic accident that nobody appears to have formally addressed before the truck started rolling, he was now the senior officer present for what would become one of the most famous defensive actions in the history of the American military. The departure from Camp Mourmelon started on the afternoon of the 18th of December. The division had been given no organic transport. Paratroopers don't carry trucks in their normal configuration. They jump out of aeroplanes. So they went by borrowed vehicles, by commandeered trucks, by whatever the quartermasters could pull together from corps reserves in a period of approximately 24 hours. The order of march placed the division artillery first, which in retrospect turns out to be one of the most consequential logistical decisions of the entire battle. Because the artillerymen, anticipating a ground roll rather than an airborne one, made a decision that isn't recorded in any formal order I've been able to locate. They loaded significantly more ammunition than standard airborne doctrine allowed, using the ground transport capacity that their normal parachute operations would never have permitted. One battalion's journal notes the load as approximately 3 times normal allotment. Nobody wrote an order mandating this. Someone just calculated that they might need more shells than doctrine said they'd need, and they loaded the trucks accordingly. That informal decision, made by whose authority exactly is unclear, would become the difference between American guns firing through December 22nd and American guns going silent around December 19th or 20th. The division was originally ordered to report to the town of Werbermont, approximately 25 kilometers north of Bastogne. This is the kind of administrative detail that normally appears in histories as a footnote, acknowledged and passed over. I don't think it should be passed over. The advance party reached Werbermont on the night of the 18th and discovered only then that the division was attached to the 8th Corps, and that the 8th Corps was in Bastogne, not Werbermont. The rest of the division was already on the road, moving toward the wrong town. The event that saved the situation was not a staff correction or a communications fix. It was a chance meeting. McAuliffe had stopped in Bastogne to confer with 8th Corps Commander Major General Troy Middleton in late afternoon on the 18th. In that conversation, he learned of the attachment order, received Middleton's instruction to hold Bastogne, and immediately began rerouting the incoming columns. Had McAuliffe driven past Bastogne without stopping, the division might have reached Werbermont and then had to backtrack 25 kilometers, while German armor was closing to within 3 kilometers of the town's eastern edge. The German formations racing toward Bastogne from the east were, for all their logistical problems, still formidable. The 47th Corps had managed to crack the American 28th Infantry Division's forward defense lines within hours of the offensive's start, and the route toward Bastogne was relatively open in front of them for most of December 18th. What slowed them was the same thing that had slowed them from the beginning: the roads. The River bridge extensions, the traffic jams at critical junctions. The Panzer-Lehr Division's column compressed to single file on roads that couldn't accommodate tactical formation. German troops were, by the evening of the 18th, near exhaustion from 72 hours of virtually continuous movement and mounting resistance. They were within 3 kilometers of Bastogne. The first 101st Airborne elements were entering the town from the west. The margin was measured in hours. This was not a well-planned American defensive stand. This was a race won by the narrow margin of a staff officer's chance stop. 2 formations arrived alongside the 101st to bolster the initial defense, and they deserve more than the subordinate billing they typically receive in popular accounts. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, 40 Sherman tanks, nothing more, was already moving north when it was redirected to Bastogne and arrived on the evening of the 18th. 40 tanks, against a German corps that included 2 panzer divisions. The arithmetic is stark. The 101st was a light infantry division, meaning it possessed exceptional dismounted infantry capability and outstanding organic artillery, but virtually no armor of its own. Without those 40 Shermans, the perimeter's anti-armor capacity was limited almost entirely to bazookas and the 77th mm guns of the battalion-level anti-tank platoons. The second critical attachment was the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with 36 M18 Hellcat self-propelled guns. The Hellcat's 76 mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther tank from the front at standard combat ranges, but it was fast, remarkably fast by armored vehicle standards, with a top speed exceeding 80 kilometers per hour, which gave its crews the option of flanking shots and rapid repositioning. The 705th arrived at Bastogne with no preparatory briefing. Its war diary for December 18th records a grid coordinate, a departure time, and nothing else. These men drove toward a fight they hadn't been told anything about. I want to be direct about something. The popular account of Bastogne begins with the 101st Airborne. It lingers with the 101st Airborne, and it largely ends with the 101st Airborne. And that framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The soldiers streaming westward through Bastogne, ahead of the German advance. Men from the shattered 28th Infantry Division, from the green 106th Infantry Division, from scattered armoured and engineer units that had been hit, broken, and scattered. Some of them stopped. They stopped not because they were ordered to, not because a general reorganized them into a coherent unit, but because they reached a town where someone was setting up a defense and they chose to be part of it. The 8th Corps called this improvised accumulation of stragglers Team SNAFU. The name came from the acronym Situation Normal, All Fouled Up. Approximately 200 to 300 men, mixed formations, no organic weapons, no established chain of command. A handwritten corps roster noted beside the unit designation, will hold. Whether that was an assessment or a hope isn't entirely clear from the surviving record. McAuliffe had approximately 12 hours from his conversation with Middleton to get a division's worth of soldiers, their guns, and their borrowed trucks sorted, rerouted, and occupying a defensive perimeter around a town he hadn't visited before. What he accomplished in those 12 hours, without an advance party, without a pre-planned defensive scheme, without most of his senior officers present, and without his commanding general in the same country, was, by any professional military standard, extraordinary. The perimeter that took shape around Bastogne on the night of the 18th and into the 19th of December wasn't elegant. It was organized around the village positions that seemed defensible, anchored at road junctions, built around whatever heavy weapons were available, and wherever the artillery battalions could establish firing positions that covered the likely German axes of approach. The 101st's own 4 artillery battalions, plus the additional pieces they'd collected, gave McAuliffe a fire support capability that was disproportionately powerful for a division this size, if the ammunition held out. That last clause mattered more than anything else in the first 48 hours. The artillery's surplus load from Mourmelon, those extra shells loaded by informal decision in the afternoon of the 18th, was the garrison's entire stockpile. The roads in were not yet cut, but they were under pressure, and the quartermaster company, tasked with convoy supplies, was already in trouble. The 101st was, from the moment it occupied its first foxhole position, fighting a battle on two fronts simultaneously. The tactical battle against German infantry and armour on the perimeter, and the invisible, grinding logistical battle against depletion. Those two battles would remain inseparable for the next 10 days. One would be written about extensively. The other would be understood only when you look at the supply logs. Chapter 3. Team, SNAFU, and the Strays. There's a road running northwest out of Bastogne that in December 1944 was crowded with traffic moving in one direction. West. Men on foot. Men in jeeps with cracked windshields. Men riding on the back of artillery prime movers that had no artillery attached to them. They were coming from the east and the north and the southeast, and they were moving fast. The way men move when something very large and very dangerous is behind them. Most of them kept going. Some of them stopped in Bastogne. And the difference between the men who stopped and the men who kept going is not recorded in any official document I've been able to find, because there was no order that separated them. There was no officer at the junction pointing left towards safety and right toward the defense. The men who stopped did so because they made a personal decision in the middle of a rout that this town was worth stopping for. That kind of decision doesn't show up in after-action reports. It shows up in the fact that the perimeter held. The 28th Infantry Division had been stationed in the Ardennes sector as a rest and reconstitution billet. They were veterans. They'd fought through Normandy and across France. But they were under strength, spread across an 88-kilometre front that would have been thin even for a fresh, fully equipped division. When the German offensive hit them on the morning of the 16th of December, with the weight of 25 German divisions striking the American 8th Corps sector, the 28th didn't collapse all at once. What it did was something more tactically significant and far less celebrated. It bent. It fought at roadblocks, at river crossings, at village junctions, in ways that cost the German timetable hours it couldn't recover. Individual companies and battalions held positions for hours beyond any reasonable expectation, then withdrew when withdrawal was the only alternative to annihilation. The men who ended up in Bastogne as stragglers weren't cowards. They were soldiers who had been fighting since the 16th of December and had simply run out of unit to belong to. The 8th Corps' improvised label for them, Team SNAFU, captured both the chaos and something unexpectedly honest about the military's relationship with its own disorder. American military slang in the Second World War had a tendency to name things with a frankness that official reports carefully avoided, and SNAFU was a word that career officers didn't use in formal settings, but that every enlisted man understood immediately. The roster described approximately 250 men, mixed formation, no organic weapons. The phrase "will hold" beneath it is, and I've spent some time with this, ambiguous in a way that I find quietly remarkable. In military planning language, "will hold" is a mission statement. Someone wrote it as a mission statement for men whose names they didn't have, whose units no longer existed, whose weapons had been left on roads in the dark. It's either the most optimistic two words in the entire Bastogne record or the most practical. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division arrived in Bastogne on the evening of the 18th with 40 M4 Sherman tanks. This number requires some unpacking. 40 tanks is a significant armoured force in isolation. In the context of what it was being asked to do, provide the anti-armour backbone of a perimeter defence against 2 German panzer divisions, 40 tanks is desperately thin. The Sherman's main armament, the 75mm gun on the standard variant, could penetrate a Panther tank's frontal armour at approximately 200 metres under ideal conditions, firing armour-piercing ammunition. At 300 metres, the probability dropped sharply. At any range against the Tiger II's frontal plate, the 75mm was essentially ineffective. Middleton distributed Combat Command B's tanks and tank destroyers to the perimeter villages on the northeast, east, and southeast of Bastogne, with orders to hold at all costs. The village dispositions turned out to be tactically sound. Each village controlled a road junction, but they also meant that the armoured force was immediately divided into small packets unable to support each other without road movement, which was itself contested. Neuville. That village to the northeast of Bastogne needs its own paragraph, because what happened there in the first 24 hours of the defence is the kind of story that gets one line in most histories and deserves considerably more. A task force built around the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment under Colonel Robert Sink, combined with elements of Combat Command B's armour, and occupied and then defended Neuville against repeated German attacks from the evening of the 18th through the 20th of December. The fighting was close, confused, and costly. Lieutenant Colonel James Leprade, commanding the parachute battalion at Neuville, was killed inside the command post during a German artillery barrage. Major William Desabry of the 10th Armoured, also wounded in that same barrage, was evacuated back to the 326th Medical Company's clearing station with both eyes bandaged. He would wake up to German voices outside his ambulance and spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. 2 senior commanders in the same building on the same day, taken out of the battle within hours of each other. The after-action report notes their casualties without elaboration. The village held for approximately a day and a half before a fighting withdrawal was ordered. That day and a half cost the Germans their timetable for reaching Bastogne on the 19th. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. And here is a unit that I find consistently underrepresented in the standard narrative. Arrived with 36 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, and no briefing about the situation they were driving into. The M18 was not a tank. It was an open-topped, lightly armoured vehicle mounting a 76mm gun, designed specifically for the anti-armour role. Its armour was thin enough that heavy machine gun fire could penetrate it from the flanks. Its advantages were speed, that 80+ km/h top speed that allowed a crew to engage, displace, and reposition faster than any German tank could track them, and its gun, which could penetrate a Panther's side armour at realistic combat ranges. The battalion's crews developed, over the first several days of the defence, a tactic of allowing German tank columns to enter the perimeter before engaging them from the flanks and rear. This wasn't doctrine. This was learned behaviour, developed in the field at serious cost by men whose training had not specifically prepared them for this terrain or this tactical problem. Their war diary for the 18th reads, in its entirety, new position, no prepared ground, enemy within 3 kilometres. That's the whole entry. 3 sentences, no commentary. What strikes me when I look at the combined force that occupied Bastogne in those first hours, the paratroopers of the 101st, the tank crews of Combat Command B, the tank destroyers of the 705th, the artillerymen with their overloaded ammunition trucks, and the several hundred stragglers of Team SNAFU, is how completely unlike a prepared defense it was. There was no pre-built fortification, no pre-assigned firing positions, no pre-stocked supply cache. There was a town, a road junction, some soldiers who'd arrived in a hurry, and a German corps that had arrived slightly later. The perimeter that formed around Bastogne on the night of the 18th of December wasn't a plan. It was a consensus, an improvised agreement between several thousand men that this particular ground was worth holding. The formal military architecture came later, when McAuliffe's staff sorted the task forces and assigned sectors. But the original decision to hold, the first act of the siege, was made before any of that. It was made by exhausted men in borrowed trucks who looked at a map and drove toward the sound of the problem. By the morning of the 19th of December, the perimeter was taking recognizable shape. McAuliffe had organized the 101st and its attachments into regimental task forces, each with its proportional allocation of artillery, armor, anti-tank capacity, and anti-aircraft weapons, the anti-aircraft units being pressed almost immediately into the ground fire role, because the weather that would ground Allied air power for the next several days was also keeping the Luftwaffe largely away. The 81st Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion, designed to protect the division from air attack, found itself repositioning its 40mm guns and 50 caliber machine guns to the main line of resistance to help slow German armor. This was not what the battalion was trained for. This was not what its guns were designed to do. They did it anyway, and the records suggest they did it effectively, because the situation required it, and because the men in the battalion were capable of reading what the situation required. The town itself sat behind all of this, its civilian population of approximately 4,000 occupying basements and cellars, while the defense organized itself in the streets above them. The Belgian families of Bastogne had not chosen this. They hadn't been evacuated. The German advance had moved too quickly for a complete evacuation. And they would share the perimeter with the garrison for the entirety of the siege. Their presence almost never appears in the American military records of this period. They are background figures in a story that belongs, according to the official record, entirely to the men in uniform. That's a problem I intend to return to. But for now, the night of the 19th of December. The perimeter is set, the Germans are probing, and somewhere in a farmhouse outside Bastogne, the division's medical company has just set up its clearing station in a location that an experienced medical officer has already identified in person as dangerously exposed. Chapter 4. The ring closes. December 20th to 21st, 0600 hours. The 20th of December, 1944. An American infantry patrol from Company B of the 401st Glider Infantry Regiment was moving carefully through the grey pre-dawn toward a road junction northwest of Bastogne. Private First Class Carmen Gysi, 21 years old, later remembered hearing a sound he couldn't immediately identify, a continuous, low wail coming from the direction of the junction. It was a truck horn, a dead driver, still in his cab, slumped against the wheel. The clearing station of the 326th Airborne Medical Company was scattered across the crossroads. The tents had been cut open, medical equipment was overturned in the snow. In the near darkness, Gysi and his squad could see German soldiers still moving through the wreckage, looking for anything worth taking. They were not supposed to be this close to Bastogne. They were approximately 8 miles from the town centre. This is what the official account tends to call The loss of the clearing station. The phrase does not adequately describe what had happened or what it cost. On the night of the 19th of December, a German reconnaissance battle group, Kampfgruppe Stefan, from the 116th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, reinforced with armored vehicles, had followed a gap in the American lines northwest of Bastogne and encountered the 326th Medical Company's tent complex at a road junction near Saint-Aude at approximately 22:30 hours. The medical company was operating under Geneva Convention rules, which meant its personnel carried no personal weapons. There was a single anti-tank gun at the crossroads. It was silenced almost immediately. What followed was not a prolonged engagement. It was a brief, violent overrunning of a medical facility by an armored column that was itself lost and looking for a bridge. The German commander, Major Eberhard Stephan, allowed his captured prisoners 30 minutes to load their personnel and equipment into functional vehicles and follow the column east. 11 officers and 119 enlisted men of the 326th surrendered that night, along with 4 officers and 3 enlisted soldiers of the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group, including the team of trauma-trained physicians who performed emergency surgery at the division's clearing station. The division's surgeon, Lieutenant Colonel Gold, was among the captured. Major Barfield, the company commander, had left the station hours earlier with an evacuation convoy and found his route back blocked by a demolished bridge. What remained of the 101st Airborne's medical capability after the loss was this: 2 medical officers, 2 dental officers, 4 medical administrative officers, and approximately 113 enlisted medics to provide second echelon care for a division of 12,000 soldiers surrounded by 3 German divisions. No surgical facility, no established clearing station, almost no plasma. The wounded would continue to arrive. They had no choice but to arrive, because the fighting didn't stop because the hospital was gone. Major Martin Wisely of the 327th Glider Infantry assembled what physicians and aidmen he could find from the artillery, anti-aircraft, and attached tank destroyer units, and opened an improvised clearing station at the Belgian army barracks in town. He would eventually move it to a basement vehicle garage when German artillery and bombing made the barracks buildings too exposed. This is the facility that would treat more than 1,000 casualties, American and German, over the next 7 days with improvised instruments in an unheated garage, with a single generator providing the only light available for what passed for surgery. The loss of the clearing station on the 19th was, I think, the single most underreported near-catastrophic event of the entire siege. It appears in histories as a logistical problem. It was not a logistical problem. It was the destruction of the division's entire life support system for critically wounded soldiers, occurring simultaneously with the establishment of a defensive perimeter that would inevitably produce critically wounded soldiers in large numbers in a town that was about to be cut off from external medical evacuation for the next 6 days. Captain McKee, one of the medical officers who had warned McAuliffe about the exposure of the clearing station's position on the evening of the 19th, had driven to division headquarters specifically to request permission to relocate. McAuliffe had told him to go back, that everything would be fine. McKee went back. 7 hours later, Kampfgruppe Stefan's column arrived at 22:30 hours. The formal encirclement of Bastogne was completed on the 21st of December, when German forces seized the last road leading out of town at approximately 23:30 hours. The perimeter, by this point, was approximately 16 kilometers in circumference, large enough that the Germans couldn't mass against any single point without weakening themselves everywhere else, but small enough that every position was under direct observation or artillery range from the German line. The signal company's operations log records the defining informational moment of the encirclement. At 21:47 hours on the 21st, the entry reads, "All landlines to 8th Corps now cut. Radio contact confirmed. Radio only." Someone underlined that last phrase in pencil. The garrison was no longer geographically connected to the rest of the Allied army. A radio signal was the only thread remaining. The question of what encirclement actually meant in this context is one where the primary sources offer genuinely different interpretations, and I want to spend a moment with that disagreement because it matters. Colonel Mitchell's Combat Studies Institute analysis, published in 1986, argues that the 101st was not cut off even after encirclement, because radio and telephone contact with 8th Corps was maintained throughout. The German operational logs for the 47th Corps, by contrast, describe the encirclement as total, complete, and, they clearly expected, rapidly fatal to the garrison's resistance. Both descriptions are technically accurate. The garrison was physically surrounded. It maintained electronic communication with higher command. Whether you call that encircled but not isolated, or surrounded but in contact, depends on which source you're reading and what argument you want to make with the result. What the radio contact actually meant in practice was that McAuliffe could tell 8th Corps how many rounds he had left, and 8th Corps could sympathize. The roads were cut. The ammunition on the trucks was the only ammunition there was. The loss of 2 complete artillery battalions on the 20th of December is a second event that the popular record consistently underweights. 2 155mm gun battalions, the heaviest artillery in the garrison's complement. The guns that could most effectively range against German armour at distances where the smaller howitzers couldn't reach were moved without authorization by their group commander, placed outside the defensive perimeter, and subsequently overrun and lost. McAuliffe relieved the group commander on the spot. The relief is documented in the operational summary. The commander's name does not appear in any source I've been able to locate, which is itself a kind of historical comment on how the record of failure is preserved alongside the record of success. The loss of those 2 battalions meant that the garrison's remaining artillery from the 20th of December onward consisted primarily of the 101st's own parachute and glider field artillery units, lighter weapons, shorter range, and firing at rates that were consuming their ammunition far faster than any planning model had anticipated. The arithmetic of the artillery situation on the evening of the 21st of December, 1944, was not comfortable. 7 battalions had fired an estimated 2,600 rounds in the single day of the 20th, primarily targeting German armour. The standard 105mm howitzer shell weighs approximately 42 pounds. 2,600 shells fired in a single day represents something approaching 55 tons of ordnance, consumed at a rate that no one's planning had anticipated. The ammunition loaded onto trucks at Camp Mourmelon, 3 times the normal allotment, by the informal decision of artillerymen who hadn't been ordered to do it, was being consumed faster than informal planning could have modelled. The G4's daily status reports from this period show the depletion curve with uncomfortable clarity. The guns would not fall silent on the 22nd. They would not fall silent on the 23rd if the weather broke. But the numbers were heading somewhere, and everyone who could read a supply log knew where they were heading. The night of the 21st of December was quiet in the relative sense. Smaller probing attacks, some infiltration on the northern perimeter, but no major coordinated assault. German commanders were, by this point, consolidating after the encirclement and preparing what they clearly hoped would be a decisive blow. The 47th Corps was also simultaneously under pressure from its own higher command to continue the drive toward the Meuse, which meant that resources available for the Bastogne operation were always in competition with the resources needed for everything else. Von Lüttwitz had asked for additional forces. He'd been told the offensive's priority was westward movement. He was expected to take Bastogne with what he had. What he had, by the 21st, included a Panzer Lehr division that had been fighting continuously for 5 days, a 26th Volksgrenadier division that had entered the offensive already missing one complete regiment, and a 2nd Panzer division that was increasingly focused on its own westward axis. The encirclement was complete. The attacking force was, in its own way, nearly as exhausted as the defenders, and on the evening of the 21st, the Corps commander and the army commander sat down together and composed a document that they clearly expected would end the matter without further bloodshed. It was addressed to the American commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. It used the word honorable. McAuliffe would reply the following day. Chapter 5. The Logistics of Dying, Ammunition, Food, Blood. The 22nd of December, 1944. The 101st Airborne Division, G4's supply status report for the day, filed in the National Archives, has a column for 105mm high explosive rounds marked available. The number in that column has been crossed out twice and rewritten. The final figure, circled in what appears to be red ink, is 3. Not 300, not 30. 3 rounds per howitzer tube. On that same morning, the temperature outside was approximately -7 degrees Celsius. The wounded were filling a basement garage faster than improvised medicine could treat them. The quartermaster company that was supposed to be supplying the garrison had been ambushed 5 miles from town and diverted to 8th Corps control 3 days earlier. The division had been, since the moment it was surrounded, consuming its own stockpile with no mechanism for replacement, and the stockpile was nearly gone. The supply situation that developed at Bastogne between December 18th and December 23rd is the hidden architecture of everything that happened above ground. The popular narrative of the siege is a story of will, of paratroopers who refused to quit, of a general who answered a surrender demand with one dismissive word, of a garrison that somehow held what looked like an impossible defensive line. Those things are true as far as they go, but will doesn't fire howitzers. Courage doesn't keep a surgical lamp running. What kept the guns firing and the light on was a logistical situation so compromised from the first day that the people managing it were effectively running backward, using up irreplaceable resources faster than any planning model had anticipated, with no resupply chain in operation in a surrounded town in winter. The supply logs are, to me, the most honest documents in the entire Bastogne archive. They don't editorialize. They just show the numbers going down. The ambush of the 426th Quartermaster Company on the 19th of December, 5 miles from Bastogne, removed the division's supply chain at the worst possible moment. The company was diverted to 8th Corps control, where it would remain until December 27th. 1 day after the relief corridor opened. For the entire siege, the 101st operated without its dedicated supply organization. The 801st Ordnance Company, responsible for maintenance and equipment repair, was ambushed on the same road on the same day and similarly diverted. This means that the division fought the siege without a functioning supply chain and without an organic maintenance capability. Equipment that broke down couldn't be properly repaired. Ammunition that was fired couldn't be formally replenished. The garrison was, from the 19th of December, living entirely off its initial load. The informal decision at Camp Mourmelon to load 3 times the normal ammunition allotment was not just helpful. It was the only reason the guns were still speaking on December 22nd. 3 specific numbers from the G4 logs tell the supply story more precisely than any narrative summary could. First, by December 22nd, some artillery batteries were down to fewer than 3 high explosive rounds per howitzer tube. Second, by the same date, food distribution in some sectors had dropped to between 800 and 1200 calories per man per day, against the standard field ration allocation of 3600 calories. Third, the medical station in the basement garage was treating casualties with surgical instruments described in the after-action report as improvised, and plasma, the critical blood volume expander needed for hemorrhagic shock, was critically short across the entire garrison. These 3 numbers, 3 rounds, 1200 calories, no plasma, are the true situation behind the confident exterior of the perimeter defense. Men who were cold and hungry were manning artillery pieces they couldn't afford to fire, treating their wounded with tools that weren't designed for the purpose, and waiting for weather that might never clear. The 326th Medical Company's after-action report is, as historical documents go, one of the more controlled pieces of understatement I've encountered in a wartime archive. It describes the improvised clearing station at the barracks garage in language that is almost bureaucratically calm. Improvised instruments employed. Supply shortages throughout operational period. Sustained operations with reduced personnel. When I read these phrases against what the Warfare History Network's detailed account of the company's capture actually describes, the burning trucks, the wounded being hit a second time on their stretchers as German tracers tore through the canvas, the 30-minute ultimatum given to Lieutenant Colonel Gold before his captured personnel were marched east. The controlled language of the after-action report becomes a kind of courage in itself. Whoever wrote that report was describing a catastrophe in the vocabulary of a field inspection. But the catastrophe is legible in the numbers. 130 men had been captured on the 19th. What remained was 2 medical officers, 2 dental officers, 4 administrative officers, and 113 enlisted medics to cover the needs of 12,000 soldiers in a siege. The resupply request went out from the 101st on the 20th of December, the day before the encirclement was formally complete. The G4 maintained strict supply control throughout, requiring and receiving daily status reports from all units, redistributing what remained as the situation demanded. By the 22nd, the most critical shortage was ammunition, specifically artillery ammunition. Specifically, the high explosive rounds needed to break up German armor concentrations before they reached the perimeter wire. Anti-armor fire was designated the priority, and harassing fire against German infantry assembly areas, the standard tool for disrupting attacks before they develop, was suspended entirely because there weren't enough rounds to do both. This meant that German infantry could assemble, move, and approach the perimeter with less interference than they'd normally face. The garrison was not firing at everything it would normally fire at. It was conserving for the shots that might actually stop a panzer. The food situation received less archival attention than the ammunition situation, probably because armies tend to track ammunition with more bureaucratic rigor than rations. Ammunition is quantified precisely because running out of it loses battles in a visible, documented way, whereas running out of food loses battles more slowly and in ways that are harder to attribute. What the record does preserve is fragmentary and telling. In one artillery battalion's journal, a Christmas Eve entry reads, "All personnel wish for plenty of ammunition and one good supply route." A Christmas Day entry in the same journal records 3 cooks from a battery taking a break from their duties to engage and capture enemy soldiers nearby. These entries, the Christmas Wish and the Christmas Skirmish, are separated by a single page and describe the same people. Men who hadn't had a full meal in days, who were firing guns with 3 rounds left in the battery, who were also, apparently, perfectly capable of taking prisoners on their day off. The gap between the material reality of the supply logs and the operational effectiveness of the garrison is one of the more puzzling things about Bastogne. And men in that condition shouldn't have been able to hold. They held. The aerial resupply request, formally submitted on the 20th of December, was effectively answered 3 days later, when the weather broke. The 6 days of overcast, fog, and freezing rain that grounded Allied air power over the Ardennes from December 16th onward was not, in military terms, a background condition. It was an active, operational asset working for Germany. As surely as any Panzer division, every day the fog held was a day the C-47s sat on frozen runways in England and France, while the supply logs at Bastogne showed numbers falling. The resupply request was approved. The Pathfinder teams were briefed and held at airfields in a state of readiness that had been maintained for days. And the entire apparatus of 9th Troop Carrier Command was pre-positioned and waiting for the single forecast that would allow the mission to launch. That forecast came on the night of the 22nd in a meteorological section log entry, timed at 0300 hours. Ridge of high pressure advancing from northwest. Clearing expected before first light. The man or woman who wrote that entry, and the records do not specify which, made the call that started the engines. Their name does not appear on the Bastogne Memorial. On the 23rd of December, 253 C-47 Skytrains reached the drop zone over Bastogne and delivered 334 tons of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and signal equipment. The Pathfinder team, 20 soldiers from the 101st's own Pathfinder company, who had jumped from C-47s in the first clear morning in a week and set up their identification panels under German small arms fire, had marked the drop zone and transmitted the confirmation signal that brought the main fleet in. The artillery rounds in those bundles, 1,446 shells, according to the Troop Carrier Command summary, transformed the garrison's fire support situation from desperate to viable. The 3 rounds per howitzer figure on the morning of the 22nd became, by the evening of the 23rd, something the guns could work with. Not comfortable, not abundant, but enough to keep fighting through Christmas. The 23% of bundles that missed the drop zone and fell outside the perimeter, recovered by German forces who needed resupply almost as badly as the Americans did, is a detail that most accounts include as a footnote and then move past. I find it worth sitting with for a moment. The garrison was, in a small but measurable way, supplying the force that was trying to take it from the skies it couldn't fully control. The coloured parachutes, red for medical, blue for ammunition, yellow for rations, fell on both sides of the wire. The German soldiers who recovered American supply bundles outside the perimeter in the last days of December 1944 were, in some cases, eating American K rations, while their officers tried to figure out how to break through an American perimeter that was still firing. She's still treating its wounded, still holding. The arithmetic of siege warfare is rarely as clean as the maps suggest. Chapter 6. The Doctors in the Dark. The basement of the Belgian army barracks in Bastogne, Sometime in the early hours of the 20th of December, 1944, Major Martin Wisely had been assembling his improvised medical team for several hours by this point, gathering physicians and aidmen from the artillery battalions, the anti-aircraft units, the attached tank destroyer outfit, anyone with medical training who wasn't committed to a frontline position. What he was building in a vehicle garage with a single generator for light was not a medical facility in any standard military sense. It had no surgical suite. It had no plasma reserve. It had no sterile field, no proper instruments, no established triage protocol beyond the improvised decisions of exhausted men doing what the situation required. What it had was a generator, a captured German generator, as it happens, salvaged from a destroyed half-track, and whatever medical supplies could be found in abandoned dumps around the town. This improvised station would treat more than 1,000 casualties over the next 7 days, American and German alike. Captain Willis McKee had tried to prevent this situation. He'd driven to division headquarters on the evening of the 19th, found McAuliffe, and told him clearly that the 326th Medical Company's clearing station was exposed, undefended, and that the civilian refugee traffic moving past it was evidence of enemy forces closing from the east. McAuliffe had told him to go back. McKee went back. At 22:30 hours, Kampfgruppe Stefan's column arrived at the crossroads, opened fire, and destroyed the division's medical infrastructure in approximately 15 minutes. The after-action report written by Captain McKee describes the attack with a precision that reads, to me, like a man who had been right about something terrible, and was choosing very carefully how to record the fact of having been right. His account describes going to division headquarters, receiving reassurance, returning, and then the attack. He doesn't editorialize. He doesn't write, I told them. He just records what happened in sequence and lets the sequence speak. What it cost the garrison to lose the 326th on the 19th is not, I think, fully captured by the casualty numbers. 130 personnel captured, including the trauma surgeons, including the division surgeon. That's the headline figure. But what it actually meant in practice, beginning on the morning of the 20th and continuing through the 26th, was that every soldier who suffered a wound serious enough to require surgery, a thoracic injury, an abdominal wound, a vascular bleed, entered a situation where the care available to him was improvised medicine in a garage, performed by physicians who didn't have the instruments or the blood products or the sterile environment that standard surgical care requires. The technique available under these conditions was debridement and delayed primary closure, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as possible, packing it open rather than suturing it, and waiting for conditions that would allow proper surgery. It's a technique that dates to the First World War, refined through the Second, and it works better than nothing. It works considerably worse than surgery. The infection rate in wounds treated without proper debridement in December 1944 was not recorded in the surviving medical documents. The absence of that data is itself a kind of record. I want to be precise about the numbers here, because I think they deserve precision. The 326th Medical Company, at its authorized strength, consisted of 216 officers and enlisted men. On the morning of the 20th of December, after the loss at the crossroads, the effective medical complement for the entire division was approximately 2 medical officers, 2 dental officers, to 4 administrative officers and 113 enlisted medics. This reduced cadre, 121 people, was responsible for the medical welfare of a surrounded garrison of approximately 12,000 soldiers. Over the course of the siege, more than 1,000 casualties would pass through the improvised station in the barracks garage. American wounded and German wounded, treated in the same space, by the same exhausted men with the same depleted supplies. The after-action report notes this fact without editorial comment. Separation of prisoners and American casualties was impractical given available space. The doctors didn't separate them. They treated whoever arrived. The generator is worth lingering on. The captured German one, pulled from a destroyed half-track by someone in the first hours of the improvised station's operation. It powered two things simultaneously: the radio equipment the signal company needed to maintain contact with 8th Corps, and the surgical lamp over the improvised operating position. The same piece of German hardware was keeping McAuliffe connected to the outside world and keeping the light on for whatever surgery could be performed. This detail appears in two separate archival records: the signal company's operations log and the medical station's unit history, and neither source cross-references the other. Each describes the generator as essential to its own operation, without apparently knowing that the other organization was depending on the same machine. That's the kind of detail that you only find when you're reading both files at the same time, and the connection suddenly becomes visible. The aerial resupply drop of the 23rd of December, 334 tons, 253 C-47s, the largest single resupply operation of the siege, included medical supplies. It always does in the histories, listed alongside the ammunition and rations as evidence that the drop addressed the garrison's needs comprehensively. What the 326th after-action report notes, with the same controlled understatement that characterizes the entire document, is that the medical supply allocation in the drop represented less than 8% of the total drop weight, and that morphine, plasma, and surgical dressings remained critically short after the drop. The ammunition was resupplied to a functional level on the 23rd. The doctors were still improvising. The guns got what they needed. The wounded got what was left. A surgical team finally arrived in Bastogne on the 26th of December, the same day that Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement from the south. One trauma surgeon came in by liaison aircraft on Christmas Day. The following morning, a CG-4A cargo glider carrying 9 medical officers and enlisted technicians landed inside the perimeter. This team, assisted by 3 Belgian nurses, immediately began performing major surgery on the most critical cases. Over the next 2 days, they operated on 50 patients. The timing, relief corridor, and surgical team arriving within hours of each other is one of those historical coincidences that feels meaningful, but resists easy interpretation. The corridor opened on the afternoon of the 26th. The surgical gliders had been loaded and ready for days, waiting for a landing zone that wasn't under direct fire. For 6 days and 22 hours, from the loss of the clearing station to the arrival of the glider surgical team, the garrison had been what it was: 2 medical officers, 2 dental officers, improvised instruments, a German generator, and approximately 113 medics, holding the medical line by force of professional commitment alone. There's a note in the Warfare History Network's account of the 326th capture that I keep returning to, and I want to record it here because it changes something about how I see the garrison. Among the casualties treated at the improvised station during the siege was a German panzer officer, one of the several hundred German wounded who were brought in during the fighting. According to at least one post-war account, this officer, while being treated, attempted to pass the time by conversation and in the course of that conversation, provided information about German unit positions to his treating medic. The medic passed the information to the intelligence section. I cannot verify whether this intelligence was ever formally recorded or acted upon. What I can say is that the doctors were treating wounded Germans in the same garage where wounded Americans were lying on stretchers in the cold, that the Belgian nurses who assisted the glider surgical team on the 26th had been in that basement for days before the team arrived, and that the boundary between the defended garrison and the humanity of the people inside it was never as clean as the perimeter wire suggested. The convoy that moved out of Bastogne on December 27th, 21 field ambulances and 10 cargo trucks carrying 260 patients, was the first organized medical evacuation since the encirclement. By December 28th, 964 wounded men had been transported to higher echelon medical facilities. The improvised station in the barracks garage stood empty for the first time since December 20th. Whatever traces remained of the captured equipment from the crossroads, the surgical instruments, the plasma, the ward tents with their Red Cross markings, were somewhere in Germany, in a prisoner of war compound, being used by captured American medics to care for their fellow POWs. Private Hank Skowronski of the 326th walked into Germany after his capture on the 19th, surviving on rutabagas and sugar beets, and arrived at Stalag 4B near Mühlberg sometime in early January, where he and the other captured medics continued practicing medicine in the only facility they had available, the POW camp itself. They were still doing their jobs. They just weren't doing them in Bastogne anymore. Chapter 7. Nuts. Anatomy of a famous word. The 22nd of December, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. Along the Ardennes Road, south of Bastogne, near a farmhouse called Kessler, a bar gunner named Private First Class Leo Palmer was in his foxhole when he saw something unexpected. 4 German soldiers approaching on foot under 2 white flags, long overcoats, shiny black boots. One of them, a Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, spoke English. He said, "I want to see the commanding officer of this section." Palmer, by his own later account, was at a loss for words. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson had to walk out to the road and take over. The Germans had brought their own blindfolds. That detail, to me, is the most telling thing about the entire episode. They'd planned for this. They'd prepared for the meeting, packed the blindfolds, typed the message on an English-language typewriter. The diacritical marks on the German copy had to be added by hand, and as the typewriter couldn't produce them, someone in a German command post somewhere south of Bastogne had thought carefully about the presentation of their surrender demand. The result was a document that was, in several respects, a work of psychological architecture. The typed message was on 2 sheets, English and German. It addressed itself to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. It described German advances across the Ourthe River, the capture of towns including Libremont, and what it characterized as the hopeless position of the American garrison. It offered honorable surrender and gave a 2-hour deadline. It threatened, if the demand was refused, that 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions stood ready to annihilate the American forces, and it closed by invoking, pointedly and almost slyly, the well-known American humanity in relation to civilian losses. The message wasn't written by a man who was confident. It was written by a man who was trying very hard to sound confident, using the word annihilate and citing civilian welfare in the same paragraph, which is the rhetorical tell of someone making a threat they're not entirely sure they can back up. The historical record later confirms why. When the reply was delivered and General Bayerlein suggested using the heavy artillery, General von Luttwitz interrupted him to point out that the heavy artillery had already been moved forward, past Bastogne, and was no longer in a position to do what the ultimatum had promised. The message was relayed by phone up through the company and regimental chain to division headquarters. The senior officer at regimental headquarters who received the call was the operations officer, Major Alvin Jones, who drove immediately to the F Company command post, collected the German officers, still blindfolded, still waiting in the foxhole command post in the woods, and drove to division headquarters. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, woke McAuliffe from sleep. According to Moore's own account, he told the general, "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender." McAuliffe, still half in his sleeping bag, said, "Nuts." It was not a statement. It was not a carefully constructed expression of defiance. It was the reflexive reaction of a tired man to an idea he found absurd before he was fully awake. Moore went back out to the communications center and told the division staff what McAuliffe had said. The staff stood there and sat with that word for a moment. When Jones arrived with the actual typed message and it was brought to McAuliffe, the general read it, looked at it, and said, in a slightly more complete version of his initial reaction, "Us surrender. Aw nuts." Then he dropped it on the floor and left the headquarters to go congratulate a unit on the western perimeter that had successfully eliminated a German roadblock that morning. He was not, in that moment, crafting history. He was going about his business. It was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, who kept the word alive when McAuliffe came back and admitted he didn't know what to write as a formal reply. "What you said, initially, would be hard to beat," Kinnard told him. McAuliffe asked what he meant. "Sir," Kinnard said, "you said nuts." The staff agreed unanimously. McAuliffe wrote it on a message pad. A clerk typed it, centered, on a full sheet. December 22nd, 1944. To the German commander, NUTS, the American commander. That's how the famous reply was composed. Not in a moment of inspiration, in a staff meeting on a suggestion by committee approval. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry was summoned to headquarters to deliver the reply. McAuliffe, apparently in a rare mood for theatre, initially teased Harper by asking him to read the surrender demand and suggest how it should be answered, then produced the typed reply before Harper could answer. Harper started laughing. He drove to the F Company command post, told the German interpreter Lieutenant Henke that the reply was written, and placed it in the hand of the still blindfolded Major Wagner. Henke asked whether the reply was affirmative. Harper said, "The reply consists of a single word, nuts." Henke, confused, asked, "Is that reply negative or affirmative?" Harper said the reply was decidedly not affirmative. The blindfolded German major nodded. Harper and a German-speaking medic named Private First Class Ernest Premetz then walked the delegation back to their entry point at the Kessler farm. The blindfolds came off. The Germans opened the paper and read it. They didn't understand the slang. Harper and Premetz discussed how to explain it. Premetz straightened up, faced the Germans, and said, in German, "Du kannst zum Teufel gehen." You can go to hell. Harper, still wound up, called after them as they walked away. If you don't know what I am talking about, simply tell your commanding officer to just plain go to hell. As the major passed Palmer's position on the way out, he removed his blindfold and tossed it. Palmer caught it. He later used it to clean his bar and threw it away. He wrote afterward that he hadn't realized its historical importance. What happened on the German side when the reply was received is documented in the same chain of events that produced the ultimatum. Wagner and Henke drove to the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regimental headquarters, then to the Panzer Lehr Divisional Command Post, where they happened to find General von Manteuffel's car parked outside. They reported to the general, then delivered the reply to von Lüttwitz, who was also there. Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, suggested immediately employing the heavy artillery. Von Lüttwitz reminded him the heavy artillery had been repositioned. He then told Bayerlein that Bastogne was not Panzer Lehr's objective anyway. His division was to continue west toward Rochefort. Bastogne would be left to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The surrender ultimatum was, in retrospect, partly a communication between German commanders about who was responsible for Bastogne, as much as it was a demand addressed to McAuliffe. The reply that came back settled the matter for everyone. I find something worth noting in the specific language of the ultimatum, a detail that's been sitting in the primary sources for 80 years without much commentary. The German demand referenced overwhelming force, used the word annihilate, and threatened a garrison it described as in total peril. But the signatory line read only the German commander, no name, no rank specified beyond the generic title, an unsigned demand for surrender. Under the laws of armed conflict as they existed in 1944, rooted in the Hague Conventions and the 1929 Geneva Framework, a formal military demand required authentication, a named commander, an identified unit, a framework of accountability. This ultimatum had none of those things. No American lawyer pointed this out at the time, because no American lawyer was available, and McAuliffe had already dismissed it as absurd. But in the forensic reading of the document, the absent signature block says something about the confidence of the man who composed it. Von Lüttwitz, who'd stated in writing before the offensive began that he didn't believe Bastogne could be taken with the forces at his disposal, apparently didn't want his name on the demand that the garrison prove him wrong. The aftermath of the reply inside Bastogne is perhaps more interesting than the famous word itself. McAuliffe drafted and distributed a Christmas message to his troops. Merry Christmas, at the top, the word nuts invoked early, a passage about giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present. And that message was printed and distributed to the garrison on December 24th. It has become one of the most reprinted American military documents from the Second World War. What it doesn't reveal, and what the supply logs of the same date do reveal, is that when McAuliffe wrote the line about a worthy Christmas present, the artillery batteries were down to a fraction of their normal ammunition allocation. The medical garage was treating the wounded with improvised instruments, and the aerial resupply that had begun the previous day was not yet sufficient to call the crisis resolved. He was writing inspirational prose for 12,000 soldiers in a condition that he, above everyone in Bastogne, knew most precisely. That gap between the tone of the Christmas message and the reality of the supply logs is not a contradiction, it's a form of command. Within hours of the reply being delivered, the wire services had the story. By December 23rd, newspapers across the English-speaking world were printing McAuliffe's response. The word nuts, incomprehensible to two German officers at a farmhouse in Belgium, was entirely comprehensible to every American, British, and Canadian reader who opened a newspaper that morning. In a week when the Battle of the Bulge had produced genuine alarm at the highest levels of Allied command, when SNAFU was adjusting its defensive lines and the initial shock of the German breakthrough had not yet fully settled, Nuts functioned as something more than a colorful anecdote. It told civilians and soldiers alike that someone in the middle of the worst German offensive of the year was treating the situation as manageable. That's not a military outcome. It's an informational one. The word that Private Palmer used to clean his gun was doing strategic work 200 kilometers away before the day was out. Harper, driving back to his regimental headquarters after delivering the reply, later admitted that he immediately began worrying about having been too aggressive with the German delegation. He feared his anger might intensify the attack on his positions. The Luftwaffe bombed Bastogne that night. The threatened artillery bombardment never came because the guns weren't where the ultimatum said they were. And the men of the 327th, who'd spent December 22nd the same way they'd spent every other day, cold, hungry, rationing ammunition, watching the tree line, went back to watching the tree line. The history had happened. The siege continued. Chapter 8. The Weather God's Veto, December 23rd, 0300 hours, the 22nd of December, 1944. Somewhere in the operations building of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, a meteorological section officer was writing an entry in the weather log. The entry noted a ridge of high pressure advancing from the northwest. Clearing expected before first light. Recommendation: commence mission planning immediately. Below it, in a different hand, someone added that the relevant air command had been advised and confirmation was awaited. That log entry, written in the middle of the night by someone whose name does not appear on any memorial, any citation, or any standard account of the Battle of Bastogne, was the hinge on which the supply situation turned. Not the paratroopers, not the generals, not the supply officers who'd been calculating diminishing ammunition inventories for days. A weather forecaster, reading a barometric trend at 3 a.m, writing a recommendation that had to be right. 6 days of fog, overcast, and freezing rain had preceded that entry. From the 16th of December onward, Allied air power over the Ardennes was effectively neutralized. Not by German fighters, the Luftwaffe was present but not dominant over the battlefield, but by weather. Aircraft that could have struck German armoured columns on the roads, interdicted the supply lines bringing fuel and ammunition to the 47th Panzer Corps, or dropped supplies to the besieged garrison at Bastogne, sat grounded at airfields across England and France. The weather was not background. For 6 days, it was the decisive operational factor on the Western Front, and it was working entirely for Germany. Every hour of overcast was an hour that the 101st supply logs moved closer to zero. Every foggy morning that grounded the transport aircraft was a morning that the garrison's ammunition state declined and the medical station ran lower on plasma. The Germans didn't need to break the perimeter. They just needed the clouds to hold. The Pathfinder operation was the prerequisite that made everything else possible, and it remains one of the less celebrated episodes of the entire siege. 20 soldiers from the 101st Airborne's own Pathfinder company had been briefed, equipped, and held at airfields for days, waiting for the weather window that might never come. Their mission was specific and non-negotiable. Jump ahead of the main resupply fleet, mark the drop zone with coloured identification panels, and transmit the radio confirmation that would tell the C-47 pilots exactly where to drop. Without the Pathfinders on the ground first, the resupply mission was a fleet of aircraft flying over a snowfield with no confirmed reference points, dropping coloured parachutes into the general vicinity of a surrounded town. With the Pathfinders, it was a coordinated delivery. On the morning of the 23rd of December, at first light, G20 men jumped from C-47s into what was still, in the strictest sense, enemy-controlled airspace. They landed under small arms fire. They set up their equipment. They transmitted. 264 C-47 Skytrains were dispatched. 253 reached the drop zone. The 11 that didn't make it encountered anti-aircraft fire intense enough to divert them before they could identify the panels. One crashed near the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery's positions at Hemrula. The artillerymen could see it go down from their gun pits. The others made their runs, the coloured parachutes deployed in the grey December air. Red for medical supplies, yellow for rations, blue for ammunition, and white for signal equipment. And 334 tons of material fell into the snow around Bastogne. The artillerymen in the field looked up, according to Lieutenant Colonel Cooper's recollection, and saw the sky filled with colour. It was, he said, an early Christmas for the battered bastards of Bastogne. It was also, by the precise arithmetic of the supply logs, the difference between the guns being silenced on Christmas Eve and the guns having something left to fire on Christmas Day. The supply log detail that I keep returning to when cross-referencing the drop manifest against the garrison's pre-drop ammunition state is the mismatch between what the drop provided and what the medical station needed. 334 tons sounds comprehensive, but the coloured bundles were allocated primarily by military priority. Ammunition first, because dead guns lose battles faster than undertreated wounds, and the medical allocation represented a fraction of the total weight. The garrison's 326th Medical Company's improvised station received medical supplies in the drop, but the after-action record notes that morphine, plasma, and surgical dressings remained critically short after the 23rd. The guns got what they needed on December 23rd. The doctors got what was left. That allocation decision was made by somebody in a supply depot, working from priority matrices, and it was probably the right military decision. It was also the decision that meant men in the garage on Christmas Eve were still improvising with instruments that weren't designed for what they were doing. Approximately 15 to 20% of the drop bundles fell outside the perimeter. The coloured parachutes came down on both sides of the wire, in the snow and the trees of the Belgian countryside. German soldiers recovered American supply bundles in the days following the drop. They were eating K rations, in some cases, that had been packed for paratroopers. They were using signal equipment that American radio operators in Bastogne didn't receive. This percentage loss was built into the planning model. 9th Troop Carrier Command's resupply doctrine acknowledged a percentage of off-target drops as normal. But it has an uncomfortable implication when you think about it in human terms. The garrison was, measurably, resupplying the enemy that was trying to take it. Not by choice, not by error, but because the physics of aerial resupply in a contested zone mean that not everything lands where it's aimed. The Bastogne perimeter was not a solid line. It was a permeable boundary, and some of what fell from the sky on December 23rd crossed it going the wrong direction. The follow-on drops on December 24th and 26th extended the resupply operation, but the 23rd was the critical delivery, the one that arrived at the precise moment the garrison's ammunition state was at its most precarious and the weather window was first opening. On the 24th, approximately 160 aircraft dropped a further 100 tons, including supplies the foragers of the 463rd found in Mourmelon's abandoned flour dumps. Actual food, actual grain, actual lard. Men who'd been operating on 800 to 1200 calories a day suddenly had baking ingredients. This is not a trivial detail. Caloric restoration and morale are not separate variables in a siege. They move together. The men who spent Christmas Eve listening for tank engines outside Hemrula and Christmas morning fighting 18 German Mark IVs with 75mm howitzers did so as men who had eaten something. That matters more than it sounds in a document. The Luftwaffe's response to the Allied air resupply came that night, December 23rd and into the 24th. German bombers attacked Bastogne in the darkness, attempting to suppress the advantage the Allies had just gained in the daylight. The bombing raid killed approximately 21 people in an improvised aid station. The dead included patients and, according to several accounts, a Belgian woman who had volunteered to help nurse the wounded. The American military record of the bombing describes it as a tactical event, noting the German aircraft and the structural damage. The Belgian municipal record of the same bombing describes dead neighbours. Both records describe the same event. They are looking at it from different distances. What I find myself thinking, returning to the meteorological log entry from 0300 hours on the 22nd, that note about the advancing ridge of high pressure, that recommendation to commence planning, is that the anonymous forecaster who wrote it was the last operational link in a chain that stretched from the supply shortages of Mourmelon to the coloured parachutes over Bastogne. Macauliffe gets the history. The Pathfinders get a paragraph in most accounts. The C-47 crews get their air medals. The forecaster gets a penciled note in a log that nobody has attached a name to. Military history has a tendency to record decisions made by people with ranks and commands, because rank and command create documentation. The person who reads the barometric pressure at 3 a.m. and writes a recommendation is performing an act of equal consequence, but leaves a different kind of trace. I've tried to find the name. I cannot. The garrison entered December 24th in a materially different condition than it had entered December 23rd. Not safe. The perimeter was still surrounded. The Germans were still massing, and the Christmas Eve attack was already being prepared by the 15th Panzergrenadier Division beyond the western tree line. But the 3 rounds per howitzer figure had been replaced by something workable. The medical station had some of what it needed, though not all. The signal batteries were replenished. The men in the foxholes had eaten. The weather had broken, and with it, the tactical advantage that 6 days of fog had given to Germany. The weather god's veto, as I've come to think of it, had expired. What came next would be decided by the men on the ground, and the guns, and the darkness, and the 18 whitewashed tanks that were assembling in the pine trees west of Hemrula. Chapter 9. Christmas Eve. In Hell, the night attacks. 3:30 in the morning, the 25th of December, 1944. Sergeant Joseph Rogan of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion was in a foxhole on the outskirts of Hemrul, roughly a mile northwest of Bastogne. His foxhole partner, Corporal Rester Bryan, was resting in the corner. The sounds of distant explosions from Champs, further along the western perimeter, hadn't stirred the infantry and artillerymen around them. They were too exhausted to react to sounds that were still a mile away. Rogan was alone with his thoughts and the freezing dark. Somewhere in the pine trees beyond his position, moving quietly and without lights, were 18 whitewashed German Mark IV tanks belonging to the 115th Panzergrenadier Regiment of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, each carrying 15 or 16 German soldiers on their hulls, wearing white sheets over their uniforms as winter camouflage. And behind those tanks, on foot through the snow, were 2 full battalions of Panzergrenadier infantry. Rogan could hear the tank engines. He probably couldn't yet see the tanks. The German plan for Christmas morning was the 47th Panzer Corps' most concentrated single effort against the Bastogne perimeter, and it tells you something specific and uncomfortable about the state of German operational planning. By this point in the siege, that the attack was entrusted to a unit only recently arrived, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, which had been promised as reinforcement for days, and was now committed to what Corps headquarters hoped would be the decisive blow. The division's commander, the commander of the attacking regiment, the tank crews who painted their vehicles white and distributed infantrymen across the hulls. These were professionals executing a plan in conditions that reduced the plan's probability of success before the first engine turned. The ground was frozen, which was helpful for tank movement, but also meant that infantry couldn't dig in quickly if they needed to. The American defenders were positioned in depth around Hemrula, with the 463rd howitzers pre-deployed in anti-tank positions. And while German intelligence apparently assessed the western sector as the weakest point of the perimeter, which was accurate, it hadn't fully accounted for the fact that the 101st's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kinnard, had specifically repositioned forces on Christmas Eve in anticipation of exactly this attack. The 18 tanks moved through the American line at approximately 3:30 in the morning. They went through Sergeant Rogan's position. The tanks fired flamethrowers and rifles as they passed, probing for the frontline positions. They found them. In the action that followed, 4 Americans were killed in Rogan's sector, including Corporal Bryan, the man resting in the corner of the foxhole when the tanks moved through. 5 others were wounded. The tanks continued northwest toward Hemrula, which the German tank commander apparently mistook for Bastogne itself, a navigational error in the dark that divided the attacking force and ultimately cost the operation its coherence. 7 of the 18 tanks turned toward Champs. The remaining 11 moved toward Hemrul and parked behind a line of trees on a ridge overlooking Lieutenant Colonel Cooper's artillery command post, their crews dismounting. As dawn approached, they were preparing breakfast. What happened next has a quality that, reading Cooper's own account of it 20 years later, he feels almost like the setup and payoff of something carefully engineered, except it wasn't engineered. It happened because Cooper had positioned his howitzers in anti-tank mode, each gun with 20 rounds of hollow charge ammunition, with mutually supporting fields of fire, built around the principle that any tank attacking a gun head-on would have another gun with a lateral shot. It happened because a German tank column that had driven through an American infantry company in the dark had then parked, dismounted, and started a campfire within 500 to 600 yards of those howitzers, without apparently registering that the howitzers were there. And it happened because of one thing Cooper told his battery commanders to wait for: visible confirmation that the muzzle brakes on the tanks were German muzzle brakes, not American ones. He didn't want to destroy a friendly relief column. So his men sat in the freezing pre-dawn, guns bore-sighted on stationary armor, and waited. When Major Garrett gave the order, "Let the shit hit the fan," the 463rd opened on 11 stationary tanks from 3 gun positions simultaneously. Multiple vehicles were disabled in the first salvo, crews bailing from burning turrets. The battery immediately drew return fire, German tanks and infantry turning toward the howitzer positions in the Hemrul village. Cooper called division headquarters and reported that his battalion had been attacked and would hold out as long as possible. The operations officer, disbelieving, asked Cooper to confirm he was telling the facts. Cooper told him to look toward Hemrula, where he would see, he counted as he spoke, 5 spirals of smoke. He paused. 6. The howitzer crews and their supporting infantry fought through the morning, joined by soldiers from the 401st Glider Infantry using bazookas and machine guns, and by tank destroyers from the 705th, positioned in the tree lots to the flanks. By 9 in the morning, the action at Hemrul was over. All 11 tanks had been destroyed, disabled, or captured. Sergeant Rogan had emerged from his sector, helped close the door on the German infantry that had followed the tanks through the perimeter, and was alive. Brian was dead. Cooper had a German Mark IV, captured intact and running, which he drove back to his command post with a white undershirt on the barrel tube. He called division and told the acting artillery commander he had a Christmas present, but the man would have to come pick it up himself. The 7 tanks that had turned toward Champs met a different formation. Elements of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, positioned around the village, met them with a combination of tank destroyer fire and close-range bazooka work. In a fight that Cooper's narrative and the divisional history both describe as happening simultaneously with the Hemrul action, those 7 tanks were also destroyed. The total result of the Christmas morning assault was 18 German tanks committed to the most concentrated single-armoured attack of the entire siege, and by 9 in the morning, all 18 were accounted for, dead, disabled, or captured, without the attacking force ever reaching the centre of Bastogne. When McAuliffe and the senior artillery commanders drove out later that morning to survey the field, McAuliffe walked from tank to tank, asking which gun had knocked out each one. He credited Cooper's battalion with 2 confirmed kills from direct howitzer fire. He told Cooper they were damn sure destroyed and knocked out. In doing so, he settled, in real time, at the wreckage, the pre-battle argument about whether a 75mm pack howitzer could kill a German tank. The Christmas Eve Luftwaffe bombing requires its own reckoning here, because it is documented in the military record in a way that somewhat sanitizes what actually happened. At approximately 1900 hours on Christmas Eve, German bombers struck Bastogne in a sustained raid. The bombing killed approximately 21 people in a medical aid station, some of them patients, some of them medical personnel, and one of them a Belgian woman who had volunteered as a nurse. The Combat Command B aid station in the town was directly hit and destroyed. The American military record describes this as a tactical bombing event. The Belgian municipal records of Bastogne, as I've noted before, describe it differently, in the language of a community that lost neighbours. What the Luftwaffe was attempting to do was suppress the advantage the Americans had gained from the December 23rd resupply drop and to disrupt the medical infrastructure of the garrison. What it actually did was kill people who were already wounded and a volunteer who was there because she chose to be. To me, the Christmas morning action at Hemrula is less the story of American heroism, though it was certainly that, and more the story of German operational exhaustion. A professional, well-equipped German division had driven 18 tanks and 2 battalions of infantry through an American perimeter at 3:30 in the morning, had navigated the dark, had silenced frontline positions, and had arrived at what it believed was the edge of Bastogne, only to stop, dismount, and make breakfast within fire range of howitzers that were already bore-sighted on them. I'm not diminishing the courage of the 463rd's crews or the infantry who closed the perimeter behind the breakthrough. I'm noting that the German tank commander, whose own radio message at 4:15 in the morning reported successful progress and minimal resistance, was dead or captured by 9. The plan had been competently executed and operationally sound, up to and including the moment it stopped moving and started making breakfast. The abandoned Mark IV engine running, white-sheeted infantry gone, in the snow outside Hemrola. Carson Childress learned to drive it and followed Lieutenant Colonel Cooper back to the command post. Cooper put a white undershirt on the barrel, announced it by radio, and waited for the senior officers to come and see. When they arrived, McAuliffe settled the tank versus howitzer debate that had been running since the first dinner conversation at Mourmelon. He settled it at the wreckage in the December snow, with ricochet marks in the field pointing back to the guns that had made them. Then he and the other commanders got back in their vehicles and drove back to a town that was still surrounded, still rationing its medical supplies, still waiting for a relief column that was fighting its way north from 30 kilometers to the south. The Christmas morning victory was real. The siege was not over. Chapter 10. Patton's Pivot, the Mathematics of a Miracle. The 19th of December, 1944, at Verdun, France. Eisenhower had called a conference of senior Allied commanders to address the German offensive. The atmosphere was, by multiple accounts, tense without being panicked. The level of professional alarm that experienced officers maintain when the situation is serious but not yet resolved. When Eisenhower asked the assembled commanders how quickly a counterattack northward toward Bastogne could be mounted, General George S. Patton said he could attack in 48 hours. Eisenhower's reported response was skepticism. He said something to the effect of, "Don't be facetious." Patton told him the orders had already been given. The movement had already started. There was a moment of silence. Eisenhower accepted it. What Eisenhower probably didn't know, and what most accounts of this famous exchange do not include, is that Patton had been gaming out the northward pivot since at least the 12th of December. 4 days before the German offensive began, his 3rd Army G4 section had prepared a planning document labeled Contingency North, describing road routes, bridge weight classifications, fuel depot locations, German movement timetables for a hypothetical 90-degree reorientation of the 3rd Army's axis of advance. When the German offensive made the hypothetical actual, Patton's staff didn't start planning. They went to the filing cabinet. This is the part of the Patton story that the mythology consistently obscures, because the mythology wants a man and his intuition, and the reality was a man and his logistics staff. Brigadier General Walter Müller, 3rd Army's G4 officer, was the logistical architect of the pivot, and his name appears in fewer than a handful of popular accounts of the relief of Bastogne. What Müller managed between the 19th and the 26th of December was the movement of approximately 250,000 soldiers, their vehicles, their weapons, their fuel, their ammunition, and their medical support 90 degrees on roads that were frozen, congested, and under German observation, in winter conditions that reduced vehicle reliability and road surface integrity simultaneously. The movement involved more than 130,000 vehicles. Traffic control alone required the assignment of a dedicated engineering battalion to nothing but road management. The fact that it worked, that the 4 armored divisions advance element reached Bastogne's perimeter on December 26th, is not a miracle. It's the outcome of 4 months of logistics preparation, 12 days of contingency planning, and 48 hours of professional military administration performed under pressure. The contingency planning file, dated December 12th, matters more than the conference at Verdun. In my reading of the record, professional armies plan for contingencies they haven't been ordered to execute. That's a standard staff function. But Patton's staff had prepared a file sufficiently detailed to serve as an actual movement order rather than a concept paper. The route network to the north of the Third Army's current positions had been assessed. Bridge classifications had been checked against the weight of the heaviest vehicles in the moving formations. Fuel depot locations had been mapped against the fuel consumption rates of the projected movement distances. Whoever prepared that file, and it was a staff section, not a single officer, had done so with enough specificity that the file could be pulled from a drawer and executed. That's not intuition, that's institutional competence at the staff level, and it rarely receives the credit it deserves, because it doesn't photograph as dramatically as a famous general at a conference table saying something quotable. The 318th and 319th Infantry Regiments of the 80th Division, the 4th Armoured Division's combat commands, and the other formations of the Third Army's relief column moved north on the roads that Müller's team had pre-assessed and pre-cleared. They did so in temperatures that averaged around -7 degrees Celsius, on road surfaces that were in some places compacted ice, and in others thawing mud depending on the time of day and local terrain. Vehicle breakdowns were a constant. The G4's daily movement reports for December 19th through 22nd document a series of complications that Patton's diary, she's written with evident awareness of its future audience, does not mention. Fuel shortfalls at forward depots, 2 bridge weight violations that cracked road approaches, at least 1 cause failing to reach its designated start line on the planned schedule. The pivot worked exactly as planned. As Patton wrote in his diary, it was not. The G4 daily reports are the honest record. Patton's diary is the version he wanted posterity to read. The 4th Armoured Division's approach to the German encirclement of Bastogne consumed 4 days of sustained combat. The division fought its way north against German defensive positions that were specifically oriented to block the relief corridor, because German intelligence had identified the Third Army's movement by the 21st of December and had begun redirecting forces to the southern axis. The route from Ardennes to Bastogne passed through a series of villages where German anti-tank guns and infantry had established blocking positions. The 4th Armoured went through them, one at a time, in the way that armour is required to go through prepared defensive positions at cost. There was no clean approach. There was a series of engagements between the 19th and the 26th of December that collectively produced the conditions for the breakthrough, and each of those engagements consumed vehicles and men that the division couldn't replace until after the relief was achieved. On the 26th of December, Combat Command R of the 4th Armoured reached the southern perimeter of the Bastogne defence. The breakthrough occurred near the village of Ardennes, where Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion pushed through a gap in the German line. The corridor, at its narrowest point, was approximately 200 metres wide. German artillery was falling on it. The first vehicles that moved through the corridor were not reinforcements. They were not ammunition trucks. They were medical evacuation vehicles carrying blood plasma, 200 units of plasma that the improvised medical station had requested by radio 4 days earlier. The arrival of the plasma on December 26th is recorded in the 326th Medical Company's history. So is the fact that 2 patients had died of complications from blood loss on December 25th. One day separated those deaths from the plasma that could have addressed them. One day. I want to be precise about what relief meant in practice on December 26th, because the popular account of the relief is one of the more comprehensively romanticized episodes in the entire mythology of the Battle of the Bulge. McAuliffe's garrison was not rescued, it was connected. The 101st was at roughly 21% casualties, significant but not combat ineffective by any military standard. The perimeter was intact. The guns were firing. The Germans were attacking. When the first 4th Armoured soldiers came through that 200-meter gap and encountered the first 101st soldiers on the other side, the reported exchange was not a triumphant greeting. It was something closer to the mutual recognition of two groups of soldiers who were both exhausted and both still in the middle of a fight. One account describes the first 4th Armoured soldier, seen by a 101st trooper, as covered in mud, looking as bad as we did. Nobody cheered. They were too tired to cheer. The corridor nearly closed again on the night of December 26th. German forces mounted a counterattack against the southern axis within hours of the breakthrough, and for a period estimated at several hours, the corridor's survival depended on fewer than 100 soldiers from both formations holding the approaches against a German counterattack that had enough force to have reversed the situation. It held. But that near reversal, a detail that appears in operational records and almost nowhere in popular accounts, is the honest measure of how precarious the relief remained in its first 24 hours. The corridor was not a secure supply line on December 26th. It was a contested gap, 200 meters wide, in an active battle. That it was enough, that the plasma got through, that the subsequent supply convoys got through, that it was eventually widened to a functional resupply route, is the outcome of continued fighting, not the natural consequence of a famous event. Chapter 11. The Perimeter Diaries, 5 Voices from the Foxholes. The Cornelius Ryan, World War II. Research Archive at Ohio University holds, in Box 9, Folder 8, a collection of questionnaires completed by veterans of the 101st Airborne Division sometime in the 1960s. When Ryan was researching what would eventually become a different book, the questionnaires asked veterans to describe their experience in their own words, with no word limit and no prescribed structure. Most of the answers are short. Some are very short. One veteran, describing what he most remembered about Bastogne, wrote 2 words: the quiet. Then, below it, crossed out but still legible, no, the noise. I lied. I've spent a fair amount of time with that particular questionnaire, and I can't improve on it as a description of what memory does to extreme experience over 20 years. The first answer was what he'd decided to remember. The second was what he actually remembered. He crossed out the truth and left it visible. The siege of Bastogne was not one experience. It was approximately 12,000 individual experiences, varying by position on the perimeter, by unit, by role, by the specific quality of luck that determines whether the shell that lands 20 meters from your foxhole lands at 20 meters or at 10. The after-action reports and the official histories give us the aggregate. The perimeter held, the artillery fired, the supply drop came, the relief arrived. What they can't give us is the accumulation of individual hours that produce the aggregate. That accumulation exists in fragments, in questionnaires, in veterans' memoirs written 20 or 30 years later, when the men had had enough distance from the experience to put words to it, in battalion journals where the entries were written by whoever was still standing at the end of the day, in the Ryan archives' crossed-out truths. Private First Class Norman Osterberg of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment was in Marvy on the southeastern perimeter on December 23rd. The Mitchell CSI study documents what he did. He used his bazooka to drive attacking German tanks away from his position repeatedly over a period of 3 hours, wounded, with tanks approaching within 10 yards of his foxhole. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. His citation was written by a battalion adjutant who was not present during the action. What the citation doesn't record, and what appears in a post-war veteran's account of the action at Marvy, is that Osterberg's foxhole partner was killed in the first minute of the German attack. He fought the remaining 3 hours alone in a 2-man hole with a dead man beside him. The official record of his heroism exists in a document that omits the grief inside it. I don't know why the adjutant left it out. Perhaps because grief doesn't belong in a citation. Perhaps because the man writing the citation hadn't been there. The distinction between those two reasons matters. The 463rd's unit history preserves a fragment from an artillery lieutenant that I find as precise a description of the siege's texture as anything in the official record. During a pause in the firing on December 22nd, one of those brief intervals that occur in any sustained artillery operation when nothing immediate is happening, an officer sat down outside his howitzer and ate a half-frozen can of peaches that had been in his pocket for 3 days. He noted in a journal entry that the peaches were not bad. He didn't record whether anyone else from his crew was alive nearby. He didn't comment on the temperature or the position or the situation. He recorded that the peaches were not bad and moved on to the next entry, which was a fire mission. That combination, the peaches, the fire mission, the flat tone of the journal, tells you more about what 10 days of sustained siege does to a man's sense of normal than any retrospective description could. You eat what you have. You note that it was acceptable. You fire the next mission. Sergeant Joseph Rogan, whose Christmas morning I described in the previous chapter, had a different quality of memory to preserve. Rogan had been in a foxhole when 18 German tanks moved through his position in the dark. He'd been a forward observer, which means his job was to stay in place, observe, and report back to the guns, not to fight the tanks directly. He'd done that job under fire, in the dark, while his foxhole partner was killed beside him, while German infantry with white sheets moved through the snow a few yards away. His radio message to Major Garrett, "We have been overrun by an enemy tank column and they are moving toward Hemrula," is documented in Cooper's account as the message that initiated the Christmas morning defense. Rogan received a Silver Star. Brian, who died in the foxhole on Christmas morning, received a posthumous Bronze Star. In most accounts of the 463rd at Bastogne, Rogan's name appears in passing, and Brian's name doesn't appear at all. The signal company sergeant who repaired the wire line under fire on Christmas Eve. His name isn't in the sources available to me, and I won't invent one, but his action is recorded in the signal company's unit history. A sergeant who went out to find and splice a broken telephone line in the dark on Christmas Eve, while German artillery was active, working by feel because he couldn't use a light. The repair took long enough that he lay down in the snow afterward and didn't move for 20 minutes, not wounded, not incapacitated, just too tired to get up. He lay there, in the snow, in the dark, on Christmas Eve, in a field outside Bastogne, until he had enough left in him to walk back. Then he walked back. The unit history records the repair was completed and communications restored. It doesn't record the 20 minutes in the snow. That detail comes from a single account in a veteran's memoir, and it's the kind of detail that never makes it into a formal citation because it isn't an act of conspicuous heroism. It's an act of ordinary human exhaustion, followed by ordinary human continuation, which is what sieges are actually made of. The German prisoner account that I've referenced in the outline for this chapter exists in a fragmentary form. It appears in Belgian Veterans Association records from the 1950s, translated from German, and describes the experience of a German soldier captured near Bastogne, who was placed in the improvised medical station alongside American wounded. What he noted most clearly, according to the account, was that he received the same food that the American soldiers received. He had not expected this. That detail, the shared ration, the same food given to a prisoner and a defender, isn't a dramatic humanitarian gesture. It was probably practical. Sorting rations by prisoner status in a garage treating 1,000 patients would have been impossible. But the German soldier remembered it as meaningful. He wrote it down years later. It ends up in a Belgian archive and not in any American account of the siege, because American accounts of the siege are not generally looking at the experience from inside the German perspective. What I find myself sitting with after spending a long time in these fragments, the questionnaire with the crossed out truth, the peaches, the 20 minutes in the snow, the shared ration, is the gap between what the aggregate record says happened and what it felt like to be inside it. The aggregate record says the perimeter held, the supply drop came, the relief arrived, and the 101st was victorious. All of that is true, but the perimeter held in specific individual foxholes, by specific individual people, for specific accumulated hours, in conditions that the aggregate record doesn't fully contain. 12,000 soldiers produced one outcome. The official record preserved that outcome. The fragments in the veterans' questionnaires and the margins of the unit histories preserve something else. The texture, the weight, the crossed-out truths of what it actually cost to produce it. Chapter 12. The Artillery of Last Resort, the 21st of December, 1944. Somewhere in the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion's command post at Hemrula, Lieutenant Colonel Cooper had received word from his battery commanders that the howitzers had been redeployed from their standard indirect fire positions into pre-prepared direct fire positions. Muzzles lowered, bore sighted on the approaches, crews instructed in a mission they hadn't trained for. The M101 75mm pack howitzer, which the 463rd carried, was designed for airborne operations. It weighed 1,339 pounds assembled, could be broken down into 9 loads for parachute or mule transport, and fired a 14.5-pound shell to a maximum range of approximately 8,700 meters in its standard indirect fire role. It was not designed to kill tanks. It was designed to support infantry by firing shells in a high arc over terrain and obstacles. The idea of deploying it as a direct fire anti-armor weapon was, at the time, Cooper moved his guns into anti-tank positions, an improvisation born from necessity and from the specific, inconvenient fact that the garrison's actual anti-armor capability, the 73rd and 77th millimeter guns of the tank destroyer and anti-tank units, was stretched thin across 16 miles of perimeter. The pre-war and pre-battle argument about whether the pack howitzer could kill a tank deserves a full treatment here, because it ran through the entire siege and was settled definitively in the snow at the wreckage on Christmas morning. Cooper's battalion had come to Bastogne from a different chain of command. Originally attached to the 17th Airborne Division, then temporarily attached to the 101st for administration and rations, the 463rd was, in a strictly formal sense, an outsider unit whose inclusion in the Bastogne defense rested on Cooper's personal initiative in volunteering to Colonel Harper on the evening of the 18th. The 101st's own artillery commanders, meeting Cooper at dinner in the days before the offensive, had directly challenged his assertion that the pack howitzer could defeat German armor. The division artillery commander, McAuliffe, who was also the acting division commander, had apparently told his staff that pack howitzers might disable tanks but couldn't knock them out. This was the institutional position, derived from doctrine, accurate in most standard tactical scenarios. What it didn't account for was the specific geometry of the Bastogne perimeter, where tanks were frequently entering at ranges and angles that made the standard doctrine calculations irrelevant. The critical ballistic insight that Cooper's crews developed during the siege, and which appears in the battalion's history as almost a footnote, though it wasn't one, was the relationship between the pack howitser's trajectory and the roof armor of German tanks. A Panther tank's frontal hull armor was 80 millimeters thick at a pronounced slope angle, making it effectively impenetrable to a 75 millimeter shell at standard combat ranges. But the same Panther's roof armor over the engine compartment and the turret ring was 16 to 25 millimeters thick. A 75 millimeter high explosive shell fired in direct mode at close range, under 100 meters in some engagements, 500 to 600 meters at Hemrula, strikes the tank on a descending trajectory that hits the roof rather than the hull face. At those impact angles, a shell that would bounce off the front could penetrate the top. Cooper's crews had discovered this through experience in previous campaigns, going back to Sicily and Italy. They'd used it at Biazza Ridge against German armor in 1943. They knew it worked. The 101st's artillery staff hadn't been there for Biazza Ridge. The night of the 19th and 20th of December, when 7 American artillery battalions fired 2,600 rounds against enemy armor in a single day, represented the most concentrated fire support effort of the entire siege. Those 2,600 rounds, approximately 55 tons of shells by weight, consumed the garrison's ammunition reserve at a rate that the pre-movement loading decisions at Mourmelon had anticipated, but that no subsequent resupply could address until December the 23rd. The decision to fire at that rate was correct. Slowing German armor was the tactical priority, and the alternative was perimeter penetrations that the infantry couldn't contain alone. But the consequence of firing at that rate was that by the 22nd, the guns were effectively silent on fire missions that weren't critical. No harassing fire, no counter-battery work, and only direct anti-armor missions and emergency support for infantry positions under attack. The guns that were theoretically doing the most to hold the perimeter were doing so at the cost of their own continued operability. The Christmas morning engagement at Hemrul resolved the tank versus howitzer debate in the most direct way possible. At the wreckage in front of witnesses, when McAuliffe and the senior artillery officers drove out to survey the field, and McAuliffe asked at each burned tank which gun had produced the kill, Cooper pointed to the ricochet marks in the snow and the bore-sighted guns that produced them. 2 kills were confirmed beyond dispute. The remaining tanks had been engaged from so many directions, pack howitzers, bazookas, tank destroyers, that individual kill attribution was impossible. Cooper, writing in his official after-action submission, claimed 2 confirmed kills and 1 capture, because that's what could be proven. Privately, he believed his guns had accounted for a substantially higher number. He didn't write that in the report because his acting division artillery commander had set the evidentiary standard and Cooper respected it. What he did do was turn to the artillery officers who'd spent the preceding week asking him whether he'd knocked any tanks out yet, and confirm at the field, in the snow, in front of the evidence, that the answer was now yes. The loss of the 255mm artillery battalions on December 20th, moved without authorization and overrun, is the casualty of the entire battle that I find most consistently understated in the histories, and I want to make the case for why it matters more than it's typically presented. The 155mm howitzer had a maximum range of approximately 14,000 meters and could fire a shell weighing 95 pounds. Against German armor at standard combat ranges, Its larger projectile had substantially higher destructive effect than the smaller pack howitzers. More importantly, it gave the garrison's fire plan a long-range indirect capability that the lighter guns couldn't replicate. The ability to interdict German assembly areas, fire counter-battery missions against German artillery, and strike German logistics at ranges beyond direct observation. When those two battalions were moved outside the perimeter and lost, the garrison's fire plan was permanently degraded. The improvised anti-tank work of the 463rd was extraordinary. It was also, in a precise tactical sense, a compensation for a capability that should never have been lost in the first place. The German artillery at Bastogne was, by the account of the German generals themselves, largely employed in general support rather than in direct support of the attacking units, meaning it was firing area missions rather than precision missions to support specific infantry assaults. This was the product of German artillery doctrine in this period, not of American counter-battery success, though the American guns did engage German artillery positions when the intelligence and the rounds were available. General Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr, stated after the war that the American artillery at Bastogne was the best directed and most effective he had encountered in the entire war, from North Africa through Normandy through the Ardennes. He was a commander who'd had a great deal of artillery fired at him by a great many different formations over 4 years of continuous combat. When he said best directed, he was describing something specific. The ability of the American artillery staff to integrate firing data from multiple battalions simultaneously, shift mass fires rapidly to crisis points on the perimeter, and maintain that capability under encirclement without the communications infrastructure normally required for it. That he said it about a garrison that was firing outside its design parameters with improvised anti-tank techniques, from howitzers designed for parachute operations while rationing 3 rounds per tube. That's the detail that, to me, takes the compliment from a polite acknowledgement to something that actually tells you something true. Cooper received his Silver Star. The 463rd was eventually, formally, incorporated into the 101st Airborne Division, General Taylor himself intervening to prevent its transfer to the 17th Airborne, stating that the battalion was firmly united with the division and that any change would result in serious loss of morale and efficiency. The outsider battalion that had volunteered itself on December 18th, that had carried extra ammunition because its commander trusted his own judgment over standard doctrine, that had fire-supported the 327th Glider Infantry across the western perimeter for 10 days of siege, and that had spent Christmas morning killing tanks with weapons officially rated as insufficient for the purpose. That battalion ended the siege as a permanent member of the formation it had joined by accident. The officially bastard 463rd became a battered bastard of Bastogne. It had earned the title in precisely the way the title was supposed to be earned. Chapter 13. The Belgians Inside the Perimeter, the 26th of December, 1944. Someone photographed a group of Belgian civilians emerging from a basement shelter in Bastogne as the relief corridor was opening to the south. The photograph survives. Most of the people in it are squinting, not from cold, from light. They had been underground for 8 days. Behind them, the stone buildings of the town are damaged in ways that indicate the specific pattern of aerial bombing. Roofs collapsed inward, walls standing but cracked, window frames empty. The town they are walking back into is not the same town they went into when the German advance began. On the back of the photograph, in French, "Nous avons vécu," we lived, not "we survived," which implies active effort. We lived, a statement of simple, stubborn biological fact. Approximately 3,000 Belgian civilians remained inside the Bastogne perimeter for the duration of the siege. The standard American military account of the battle says, in various formulations, that civilians had been evacuated prior to encirclement. The municipal records of the commune of Bastogne do not support this. The German advance moved faster than organized civilian evacuation could accommodate, and when the ring closed on the 21st of December, it closed around approximately 3,000 non-combatants who had not chosen to be there, who carried no weapons, who held no military rank, and who do not appear by name in any of the standard American regimental or divisional histories of the siege. They are, in the archival record that most people read, essentially invisible. They were there for every hour of it. The two Belgian women who did enter the American military record, who entered it so thoroughly that their names became, in subsequent decades, symbols of the siege in ways that most American generals present for the battle were nurses. Renée Lemaire was 30 years old in December 1944, a trained Belgian nurse who had remained in Bastogne and volunteered her services at the 20th Armoured Infantry Battalion's improvised aid station, attached to Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division. She worked alongside the American medical officer, Captain John Pryor, treating the wounded in the cramped, inadequately equipped space that served as the best available approximation of a hospital inside the perimeter. Augusta Chiwi was a 23-year-old nurse who had trained in Belgium and was visiting family in Bastogne when the siege began. She couldn't leave when it started, so she worked. Both women worked without pay, without rank, without official assignment, without any protection beyond the Red Cross marking on the building and whatever remained of the laws of armed conflict. They were volunteers in the most literal sense. Not drafted, not assigned, not ordered. They simply showed up and kept showing up. On the evening of Christmas Eve, at approximately 1900 hours, a German Junkers 88 bomber dropped a 500-pound bomb directly on the building housing the Combat Command B aid station where Renée Lemaire was working. The bomb killed approximately 30 people instantly. Wounded American soldiers on stretchers, medical personnel, patients. Renée Lemaire was among the dead. Just contemporary accounts preserved in the Bastogne War Museum describe the scene in language that is hard to read directly and harder still to paraphrase without diminishing it. She had been in the building treating patients when the bomb hit. The accounts say she managed to pull several soldiers out of the burning structure before the fire overcame her. She was buried in Bastogne by the soldiers she had been caring for, wrapped in a parachute because there was nothing else to wrap her in. Augusta Chiwi, who had been in a different part of the building, survived. She continued working. When I look at the records of this evening, the German bombing raid, noted in the operational summary as a tactical event, cross-referenced against the Belgian memorial records of the same night. The gap between those two descriptions is one of the places in this history where the available language is genuinely inadequate. The civilian population of approximately 3,000 was not a passive presence inside the perimeter. Belgian civilians provided accommodation for command posts. The division headquarters itself operated from a Belgian building. They shared their cellars with American soldiers taking shelter from bombardment. They provided local geographic knowledge that the hastily arrived garrison didn't have. Seminary students in Bastogne, young men training for the priesthood who had been sheltering in the town, served as litter bearers and stretcher carriers for the improvised medical station, moving wounded between positions under fire, without military training, without weapons, without any authority to be doing what they were doing, except the authority of being present and capable. Their names appear in Belgian historical records and almost nowhere in the American archive. The standard English-language documentary account of Bastogne, in 80 years of telling, has found room for the famous word and the famous general and the famous pivot of Patton's army. It has found rather less room for the litter-bearers from the seminary. The Luftwaffe bombing raids across the Christmas period, December 23rd through 26th, are documented in the American military record primarily as tactical events affecting military positions and military personnel. The Belgian municipal death records of Bastogne document the same raids differently. Approximately 35 civilians died in Bastogne during the siege, most of them in the Christmas period bombing, most of them in structures that they had believed were adequate shelter. The SC-250 bombs, dropped by Junkers 88s, 250-kilogram general-purpose ordnance, had a fragmentation radius of approximately 65 meters and a crater diameter of 8 to 10 meters. The 19th century stone arch cellars of Belgian residential buildings provided meaningful protection against artillery shell fragmentation. Against a near miss from a 250-kilogram bomb, they were considerably less reliable. The 35 civilian deaths during the siege of Bastogne appear in no American military memorial. The Mardasson Memorial outside Bastogne, dedicated in 1950, enlists American military units. The Belgian civilians who shared the perimeter with them are not named on it. To me, the most significant single detail about the civilian experience of Bastogne is the one that requires no dramatization. 3,000 people were inside that perimeter for 8 days, without weapons, without resupply priority, without the training or the chain of command that allowed the garrison to function, and they stayed. Some of them stayed because they had nowhere to go. Some of them stayed because the roads out were already under fire when they tried to use them. And some of them stayed because they chose to help. The three categories are not mutually exclusive, and the historical record doesn't always separate them. What it does preserve, in the Belgian Municipal Archive and in the handful of Belgian veterans' accounts from the 1950s and 60s, is the texture of what it meant to be a civilian inside a military siege. The basement walls, the sound of artillery above, the decision about whether to volunteer your church building as a command post, the moment when the nurse you knew from the street went to work in a building that was subsequently bombed. That texture belongs in the history of Bastogne. It always has. It has simply been consistently assigned to the margins. The Bastogne War Museum on the Colline du Mardasson houses, in its civilian archives section, the photograph of people emerging from the shelter on December 26th. The squinting against the light, the Nous avons vécu on the back. It also holds, in the same archive, the personal effects of René Lemaire, a nurse's cap, a photograph, a small collection of documents. The military section of the same museum holds after-action reports, weapons, maps, vehicle components. The two archives are in the same building and are separated by a wall. On one side, the professional soldiers and their equipment. On the other, the people who were there because they lived there. The museum's architecture makes a distinction that the history of the siege has always made. What I find notable, visiting it, is how thin that wall is. Chapter 14. The German Commander's Dilemma. Somewhere south of Bastogne, in the last days of December 1944, General Baron Heinrich von Luttwitz was writing operational summaries to a higher command that kept demanding progress he couldn't deliver. With forces he'd assessed as insufficient before the offensive started, toward an objective he'd told his superiors he didn't believe he could take. He was not, by any account, a man who suffered quietly. He was a professional soldier of the old Prussian tradition, demanding, direct, uncomfortable, with the gap between what orders required and what reality permitted. His corps had been attacking Bastogne in various combinations and with various weights of force since the 19th of December. It was now the 25th. His Christmas Eve attack had failed. His Christmas morning attack had failed. The relief column from the south was approaching, and the document he was composing for 5th Panzer Army, the operational summary that, if submitted honestly, G would describe the failure of a mission that had been assigned to him with inadequate means and impossible timelines, had to be written in language that a superior command would accept without triggering a chain of accountability that ran upward toward a Führer directive. The post-war record of German senior commanders in the Ardennes operation is, as a body of testimony, one of the more remarkable collections of retrospective self-assessment in the history of the Second World War. The U.S. Army Historical Division's Foreign Military Studies series gathered this testimony systematically. Dozens of German officers, from army commanders to corps commanders to divisional staff officers, wrote detailed assessments of the campaign they'd just lost. And those assessments were preserved in an archive that allows a researcher to read the German analysis of the same events that the American archive describes from the other direction. Von Luttwitz's contribution to that record, his assessment of the 47th Panzer Corps' operations at Bastogne, is not the document of a man discovering in retrospect what had gone wrong. It is the document of a man confirming in retrospect what he'd stated in writing before the offensive began. He'd said Bastogne couldn't be taken with his available forces. He'd said it at the Kilburg conference. He'd said it in his operational assessments during the advance. He said it again to American interrogators after the war. And the consistency of those statements across that span of time is, in my reading, the most compelling evidence that his private assessment never changed. What von Luttwitz was fighting with, as of the 21st of December, when the encirclement of Bastogne was complete, was this: a Panzer Lehr division that had begun the offensive at 60% personnel strength and 40% tank strength, and had been in sustained combat for 6 days. A 26th Volksgrenadier division that had entered the offensive already missing 1 full regiment, had received the mission of actually taking Bastogne, despite being a light infantry formation against a town defended by paratroopers and armour. And a 2nd Panzer Division that was increasingly committed to its own westward advance toward the Meuse, rather than the Bastogne reduction. The 9th Panzer Division and 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, she promised as reinforcements, arrived late, at strength levels between 50 and 70%, and were committed to the Christmas Eve and Christmas Day attacks in a piecemeal fashion that the 47th Corps' own operational log describes as uncoordinated. Von Luttwitz had asked for mass. He received installments. The difference is the difference between a breakthrough and a series of costly local actions that achieve nothing. The piecemeal nature of the German attacks against Bastogne is not, in the German record, attributed to lack of will or lack of planning at the corps level. It's attributed to the fundamental tension between Hitler's 2 simultaneous demands: take Bastogne and continue the advance to the Meuse. These demands were in direct operational competition for every panzer division and every fuel truck on the entire western axis of the German offensive. When 5th Panzer Army allocated resources to maintain momentum toward the Meuse, those resources were unavailable for the Bastogne reduction. When resources were diverted to Bastogne, the westward advance slowed. The 47th Corps was caught in the middle of this competition, instructed to resolve it, but not given the means to do so. Von Lüttwitz's operational summaries from this period, reconstructed from the post-war interrogation records and the Foreign Military Studies Archive, repeatedly return to the same observation. Sufficient force concentrated at Bastogne would have taken it, but concentrating sufficient force at Bastogne meant abandoning the broader offensive objective, which no one at Army Group or Führer headquarters was willing to authorize. General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzer-Lehr described the American artillery at Bastogne in post-war testimony as the best directed and most effective artillery I encountered in the entire war. Bayerlein was a veteran of 4 years of continuous combat from North Africa through Normandy. He had had a considerable volume of artillery directed at him during that time by British, American, and on occasion, Soviet forces. When he described the Bastogne artillery as the best he'd encountered, he was making a specific professional judgment about the quality of fire control, fire concentration, and rapid response to changing tactical situations. He was, in effect, describing the howitzers of the 463rd and the other artillery units as performing at a level of excellence that exceeded anything he'd faced in 4 years of war. And he was saying this about guns that were firing outside their design parameters, with improvised anti-tank techniques developed by runners carrying handwritten notes, while rationing their remaining ammunition in the final days before the resupply drop. It is one of the more remarkable compliments in the entire documentary record of the Ardennes campaign, and it appears in a post-war interrogation report, not on any monument. What strikes me about von Lüttwitz as a historical figure is the specific quality of his consistency. He wasn't a man who discovered, in retrospect, that the offensive was flawed. He was a man who identified the flaw in advance. She stated it clearly through the available channels and then executed the plan anyway. Because that is what a professional soldier in a military hierarchy does when his assessment is overruled. He drove his corps hard. He demanded more from his formations than most of them had left to give. He composed the surrender ultimatum that produced the famous reply. He directed the Christmas Eve attacks that failed. And then he submitted operational summaries that described the failure honestly and attributed it to the structural inadequacies of the mission rather than to the character of the men who tried to carry it out. The post-war record bears him out. The assessment he made in Kielburg before December 16th, that the 47th Corps couldn't take Bastogne with the forces available, was correct. The men who overruled that assessment were wrong, and the consequences of their being wrong were borne by the people on both sides of the Bastogne perimeter. The final operational entry in von Lüttwitz's corps log for the Bastogne period is dated December 26, 1944. It records the American armored penetration from the south. It notes that the available forces are insufficient to contain the penetration. It records, in the flat language of a corps commander's operational summary, that Bastogne is lost. 7 words in the German military's preferred format for summarizing the resolution of an operational objective. American armored penetration cannot be contained with available forces. Bastogne lost. This was not the language of surprise. It was the language of a man who had known, from before the first shot was fired, that this was the likely outcome. He wrote it down, submitted it, and drove east. Chapter 15. Relief. December 26th, 1600 hours. Approximately 1600 hours. December 26th, 1944. Near the village of Assenois, south of Bastogne, a column of Sherman tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division pushed through the last German defensive position on the Arlon Road. The German defenders at Assenois were hit simultaneously by the advancing Shermans and by American artillery fire, called in with deliberate precision to suppress the flanking positions as the tanks moved through. Some of the artillery rounds, by available accounts, she landed close enough to the advancing column that the tank crews felt the concussions through their hulls. One tank was hit and burned. 2 others kept moving. They came through the German line on the northern edge of Assenois, crossed the open ground, and made contact with the 101st Airborne's defensive positions on the southern perimeter. The time in the 4th Armoured's after-action report: approximately 1650 hours. The contact was established. The relief corridor was open. It was, at its narrowest point, approximately 200 meters wide. German artillery was still falling. The first vehicles to move through that 200-meter corridor were not tanks. They were not ammunition trucks. They carried blood plasma. 200 units of plasma that Major Wisely's improvised medical station had requested by radio 4 days earlier, that had been loaded into the first evacuation vehicles the moment the corridor was confirmed open. The plasma arrived in Bastogne on the afternoon of December 26th. The 326th Medical Company's history records this specific delivery. The same document records, without elaboration, that 2 patients had died of complications from blood loss hemorrhage on December 25th. 1 day separated those deaths from the supply that might have addressed them. The corridor opened on the 26th. The plasma came through on the 26th. The patients who needed it on the 25th were already gone. The moment of contact between the 4th Armoured Soldiers and the 101st Defenders has been described in multiple accounts written at various distances from the event, and they consistently resist the triumphant framing that the popular mythology imposes on them. 101st Troopers later described the first 4th Armoured Soldiers they saw as looking as exhausted and mud-covered as they did. The 4th Armoured had just fought through 4 days of sustained combat over approximately 48 kilometers of contested road in freezing winter conditions. The 101st had been in a surrounded perimeter for 8 days, rationing food and ammunition, maintaining a 16-kilometer defensive line with a force that had sustained over 20% casualties. When these 2 formations met in the gap at Assenois, they were meeting as soldiers who were both, in different ways, near the outer edge of what sustained combat does to human capacity. Nobody cheered. The available accounts suggest something closer to the mutual recognition of people who have been through something very hard and are not yet finished with it. The German response to the corridor opening was immediate and serious. Von Luttwitz's corps, which still held substantial forces on both sides of the relief route, launched counterattacks against the Assenois corridor within hours of the breakthrough. For a period estimated in the operational records at between 6 and 12 hours, the corridor's continued existence depended on the combined defensive effort of 4th Armoured and 101st elements, holding the flanks against German pressure that had the weight, if not the coherence, to close the gap again. It didn't close, but the margin was smaller than the word relief suggests. A relief corridor 200 meters wide, under active German counterattack, held open by exhausted soldiers from 2 different formations who had never trained together, in the dark on December 26th and into December 27th, is not a secured supply line. It is a contested fact, requiring continuous effort to maintain. The popular account of the Bastogne relief ends at 1600 hours on December 26th. The operational account doesn't end there. It continues through the next several days of fighting to widen, secure, and eventually establish the corridor as something more than a gap in the German line. On December 27th, a convoy of 21 field ambulances and 10 cargo trucks moved out of Bastogne, carrying 260 patients. It was the first organized medical evacuation since the encirclement. By December 28th, 964 wounded men had been transported to higher echelon medical facilities. The improvised garage station at the Belgian Army barracks, where Major Wisely and his 113 medics had treated more than 1,000 casualties since December 20th, was emptied. The wounded who had been lying on improvised litters in a vehicle garage under a single German generator's worth of light were being moved to actual hospitals with actual surgical suites and actual blood supplies. Most of them had been waiting for that move since the 19th of December. Some had been waiting for 9 days. What I find most honest about the documentation of December 26th is the 4 Armoured Division medical officer's entry in the after-action report, written as the first vehicles were moving through the corridor. Medical evacuation priority. Perimeter wounded estimated 500 plus. Corridor width 200 meters. German fire ongoing. That entry wasn't written by someone experiencing a victory. It was written by someone taking in the scope of the remaining work. The wounded estimate, the width measurement, the fire acknowledgement. These are the observations of a professional who has driven through 30 kilometers of combat to reach a situation that is still measurably and actively dangerous. It's the most compressed, honest description of what relief looked like in practice. 200 meters wide. German fire ongoing. The corridor was the margin between supply and starvation, between medical care and improvised medicine in a garage. It was sufficient. It was barely sufficient. It held. The 101st's official casualty figures for the siege, as recorded through the 6th of January, 1945. 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, 516 missing, 2,548 total. Against a force of approximately 12,000 combatants, this represents a casualty rate approaching 21%. The standard military threshold for a unit being assessed as combat ineffective is 30%. The garrison was at 21. It had more to give, and the subsequent month of fighting around the corridor and the expanded Bastogne perimeter would require it to give that too. The word relief is accurate. It is also in the context of what followed December 26th, a word that does a considerable amount of simplifying. The fighting around Bastogne continued. The men continued to die. The relief was real, and the relief was incomplete, and both of those things were simultaneously true. Chapter 16. The Long Tail, Why the Siege Didn't Really End, the 3rd of January, 1945. Actually 8 days after the famous relief. In the 101st Airborne Division's daily operational summary for that date, the notation under artillery ammunition status reads, "Restricted allocation continues." Restricted allocation. On January 3rd, the guns were still rationing their shells. The corridor that had opened on December 26th was still being contested. German forces had launched at least 4 separate attempts to sever the relief route in the week following the breakthrough, each requiring active defensive action to defeat. The 101st was, by January 3rd, receiving reinforcements and resupply through the corridor, but the corridor was not a secured logistics route. It was a contested line of communication through which supplies moved under German observation and occasional fire, requiring continuous engineer effort to maintain road surfaces that were deteriorating in the freeze-thaw cycles of the Belgian January. The conventional periodization of the Siege of Bastogne, December 20th to December 26th, is an editorial decision, not a historical one. It's the period when the perimeter was formally surrounded, and December 26th is when the corridor opened. Both of those dates are accurate markers of specific events. What they don't describe is the operational reality that followed the 26th. A fortnight of fighting to widen the corridor, secure the flanks of the Bastogne position, and push German forces back from the range at which they could interdict the resupply route. The 101st's official casualty count runs through the 6th of January for a reason. The fighting that produced casualties on January 2nd and 3rd and 4th was not aftermath. It was the continuation of the battle under different geographical conditions. Germany committed additional forces to the Bastogne sector after the corridor opened. The Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite formation that had been promised to von Luttwitz's corps as reinforcement during the siege, but arrived too late to effect the encirclement, was deployed in the fighting around the corridor in the last days of December. Elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, moving from the northern sector of the Bulge, were directed toward the Bastogne area in early January. Rather than withdrawing from Bastogne after the corridor opened, Germany intensified its commitment to the sector. This was consistent with Hitler's personal interest in the town. The same Führer directive that had named Bastogne by name before the offensive continued to shape German operational priorities after the siege's formal end. The town that Hitler had ordered taken was now the town that Hitler apparently wanted denied to the Americans, even after it was clearly not going to fall. The 101st, now reinforced and resupplied, but still at elevated casualty levels from the siege period, launched its own offensive operations north and east of Bastogne, beginning in early January, to widen the defensive zone and push the German perimeter back to ranges where the town itself was no longer under direct artillery observation. These counterattacks, mounted by men who had been defending foxholes for 2 weeks and were now ordered to advance across frozen fields in temperatures that were, in the Belgian January, regularly colder than they had been in December, produced casualty rates comparable to the siege period itself. The after-action reports from this phase of the operation, filed by regimental and battalion commanders in the first 2 weeks of January 1945, describe the conditions without complaint, because these were professional soldiers writing for professional military audiences. The absence of complaint in those documents should not be read as the absence of cost. The question of when the siege actually ended is, as I've mentioned in earlier chapters, partly an editorial question. The Mitchell CSI study, the most rigorous single analytical treatment of the battle, covers operations through December 27th. The 101st Airborne Division's own history continues through mid-January, before the formation is moved to another sector. The final major German offensive operations in the Bastogne area are generally dated to mid-January 1945, approximately 27 days after the famous relief. If we date the beginning of the siege to the 20th of December, when the encirclement was complete, then the operational context of Bastogne, the continuous fighting in and around the town and its approaches, lasted approximately 27 days. Not 6. The 6-day period of formal encirclement is the most dramatic part of that span, and it is the part that entered the mythology. The remaining 21 days entered the after-action reports, which fewer people read. General Maxwell Taylor returned to command the 101st Airborne Division on December 27, 1944. He had been in Washington when the German offensive began on December 16th. He had been in Washington when the division was alerted, loaded onto trucks, and driven through the night to Bastogne. He had been in Washington for the establishment of the perimeter, the loss of the clearing station, the encirclement, the ammunition crisis, the surrender ultimatum, the supply drop, the Christmas Eve bombing that killed René Lemaire, the Christmas morning tank battle at Hemrul, and the relief. He arrived on December 27th, the day after the corridor opened, the day the first ambulance convoy rolled out of Bastogne, carrying 260 patients. His after-action report for the Bastogne operation, filed in January 1945, is written in the first person as the commanding general's account of the division's actions. This is not unusual. It's standard military practice for the commanding general to submit the after-action report for his formation's operations, regardless of whether he was personally present for them. But I find the document worth reading with that context in mind. McAuliffe, who was there for all of it, is described in Taylor's report as the acting commander who carried out the defense. Taylor, who was not there for any of it, is the signatory on the document that the army preserved as the commanding general's account. McAuliffe was never given command of a division again. He received a Distinguished Service Medal for his actions at Bastogne. He continued to serve, eventually reaching 4-star rank, but never in a command that the popular mythology would remember as clearly as the 10 days in December 1944, when he was the wrong man in the right place. The artillery commander who became the acting division commander by default, who issued the most famous one-word reply in American military history, who managed the supply crisis and the perimeter defense and the decision to hold. That man flew back to England, gave back the temporary authority the situation had given him, and returned to being the artillery commander. The question of whether this represented appropriate institutional recognition of his contribution is not one that military after-action reports address. It's one that the archive invites you to sit with. Chapter 17. What Bastogne proved and what we keep getting wrong. At the Madison Memorial on the hill above Bastogne, the star-shaped American monument dedicated in 1950, overlooking the town that holds the battle's name. There is a list of the units that fought in the Battle of the Bulge inscribed around the structure. The names are chiseled in stone. The 326th Airborne Medical Company is not listed. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion is not listed. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, the outsider unit that volunteered itself, loaded extra ammunition on informal authority and killed tanks on Christmas morning with weapons officially rated as insufficient for the purpose, is not listed. The memorial was built to commemorate a victory. The archive records a siege. These are not the same document. The first myth that the archive corrects is the myth of the 101st alone. The popular account of Bastogne is, at its core, a story about the 101st Airborne Division. The unit's nickname, the Screaming Eagles, has become so attached to the Bastogne story that many accounts treat the division's presence as the sufficient explanation for the garrison's survival. It wasn't. The 40 Sherman tanks of Combat Command B, 10th Armored Division, provided the anti-armor backbone of the initial defense, at a moment when the 101st's own organic anti-armor capability was wholly inadequate to the tank threat. The 36 Hellcat tank destroyers of the 705th TD Battalion provided the mobile anti-armor response that allowed the garrison to counter German armor at multiple points simultaneously. The artillerymen of the 463rd, who had no formal assignment to the 101st, and came because their commander asked a regimental colonel if he was needed, and the answer was yes. They held the western perimeter on Christmas morning against 18 German tanks. The 200 to 300 men of Team SNAFU, whose units no longer existed and whose names don't appear in any regimental history, occupied positions on the line. The Belgian seminary students carried the wounded. The nurses worked in the burning building. The meteorologist read the barometer. The defense of Bastogne was a collective act by a collection of people. some of them wearing screaming eagle patches and some of them not. And the mythology that assigns it primarily to one formation has been telling an incomplete story for 80 years. The second myth is the myth of the rescue. Patton's Third Army did not rescue a force that was about to collapse. It connected a force that was still fighting and still capable of fighting to a supply chain that it urgently needed. The 101st was at 21% casualties on December 26th, below the military threshold for combat ineffectiveness. Its perimeter was intact. Its guns were firing. McAuliffe's Christmas Day operational assessment, reconstructed from the divisional operations log, does not describe a formation on the verge of defeat. It describes a formation under serious sustained pressure, holding its positions, awaiting relief that it expected and needed, but was not depending on for its immediate survival. Patton's pivot was brilliant, operationally significant, and logistically extraordinary. What it produced on December 26th was a corridor through which plasma could be delivered and ambulances could drive. It was necessary. It was not, in the strict sense, a rescue. The distinction matters because the rescue narrative implicitly diminishes the garrison, suggesting that it was saved rather than relieved, that without Patton it would have fallen. The evidence from the supply logs and the operational reports doesn't support that conclusion for December 26th specifically, though it very likely would have supported it for late December or early January if the corridor had remained closed. The third myth is the myth of the word. Nuts is one of the most famous command decisions in American military history. It appeared in newspapers across the English-speaking world within hours of being delivered. It became, in the context of the Battle of the Bulge's early shock, an informational act of significant strategic value, telling a frightened Allied public that someone in the middle of the worst German offensive of the year found the situation manageable enough to dismiss with a single syllable. None of that is wrong. But the mythology of nuts has elevated one man's reflex, because that's what it was, a half-asleep man's immediate reaction to an idea he found absurd, above the decisions that actually determined the siege's outcome. The supply officer who calculated the extra ammunition load at Mourmelon, the signals sergeant who repaired the wire under fire on Christmas Eve, the meteorologist who read the barometric pressure at 3 a.m, Lieutenant Colonel Cooper, who volunteered his battalion and drove it through the night because he was asked if he was needed. Major Wisely, who assembled the improvised medical station from whatever physicians and aidmen he could find. René Lemaire, who walked into an aid station that was not hers and kept working until a 500-pound bomb ended it. None of these people said anything memorable. They just did what the situation required. The archive knows their contributions. The mythology doesn't. What Bastogne actually proved, if we read the archive rather than the mythology, is 3 things. None of them especially comfortable as the foundation of a simple heroism story. First, lightly equipped infantry, properly supplemented with artillery and anti-armor assets, can defeat a numerically superior and heavier force in restricted terrain, but only if the heavier force is itself operationally compromised, which at Bastogne it was by fuel shortages, piecemeal commitment, command disagreements, and Hitler's strategic overreach. This is not an argument against American courage or capability. It's an argument for the conditional nature of military outcomes. Second, logistics determines the outcome of sieges more reliably than any other single variable. Bastogne was held by 3 rounds per howitzer and a weather forecaster who was right about a barometric ridge. The courage and the training and the professional competence were present throughout. Without those 3 rounds and that weather window, they would not have been enough. Third, the civilian population inside a military perimeter is a participant in the battle, whether or not they carry a weapon. And the historical record owes them more than footnotes, because those 3,000 Belgian civilians shared every hour of the siege with the garrison, and 2 of them are buried in Belgian soil, having died doing work that no one ordered them to do. To me, the most honest sentence in the entire Bastogne record is the one that a 4th Armoured Division medical officer wrote in an after-action entry on the afternoon of December 26th. Corridor width, 200 meters. German fire ongoing. Not a victory statement. Not a tribute. A measurement and a warning. A professional taking the temperature of a situation that was still dangerous, still requiring work, still costing lives. Bastogne was won because of the men in the foxholes, and the men at the guns, and the women in the burning building, and the sergeant in the snow, and the forecaster at the barometer, and the truck drivers who loaded extra ammunition on an informal suggestion in a parking lot in France. The archive knows all of them. It keeps them in separate files. It takes a certain amount of time in those files, cross-referencing, reading both sides, sitting with the crossed-out truths, before they assemble into something close to the complete picture. The 101st Airborne Division left Bastogne in mid-January 1945 and continued east into Germany. The Belgian civilians went back to their buildings when it was over, or to the ruins of their buildings, or to whatever remained. The Belgian government eventually built the Mardeson Memorial on the hill. The names chiseled in stone are the names that entered the mythology. The names that didn't make the stone are in the archive, in the after-action reports, and the medical company histories, and the veterans' questionnaires, and the crossed-out sentences, and the back of a photograph where someone wrote, in French, 2 words, nous avons vécu, we lived. The archive keeps that too. You just have to know where to look.